the EscapeGoat podcast. A podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Fagiani, and several different guests. Welcome to the EscapeGoat podcast, episode 41. And I'd really like to welcome back first someone who's been on the podcast twice before. This is the lovely Kit Power. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Good to be here. Excited to be finishing the trilogy.
Yeah, well, we really are. Yeah, we're going to put this to bed. Bury it deep down at the crossroads at midnight. And I'd also like to welcome a man who needs this introduction, Jack Graham. How are you?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm actually not all that well at the moment, but I think I'm sufficiently fighting fit to be on the show. Don't worry, listeners, I'm fine. I've got a bug or something, but so if I'm a bit, if I disappear halfway through and you hear sort of desperate retching sounds in the background, that's what that'll be. But no, I'm basically, no, actually what it'll be is I'm just disgusted by my fellow co-hosts, obviously.
Jack, you know that we're British, a question of how are you is not meant to be answered with any degree of seriousness. This is.
Yeah, well, what's the point in being ill if you can't use it to, bully people through embarrassment and oversharing? That's how I look at it.
Every cloud.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No, very glad to have you on, Jack, and it's thank you for joining me and Kit to as Kit said, finish the trilogy because
I'm stoked because the third part is always the best, isn't it?
Historically, that's always been the case.
Oh yeah, I mean the third testament of the Bible is that's so good they couldn't release it.
I'm gonna say, as someone living through it, I'm not that stoked. I'll be honest, it's kind of shit if I'm honest.
I think we're just living through the extended final chapter of the Bible.
That's true. Yeah.
We're not onto the third bit yet.
Revelation Part 2. Yeah. The Revelation strikes back.
I don't think we are living in the Book of Revelation because that at least had a kind of surrealistic grandeur to it. We're not just in hell. We're in a kind of drab, boring hell.
Yeah,
it hasn't even got the hallucinatory imagery. That would be something.
We're in the bit of hell that's the equivalent of the the sub basement with the sign on the door saying "Beware of the leopard."
Yeah.
See, I think we're living through Book of Revelation, but we didn't get the good shit that the person writing it got. That's what I think.
Oh, so it's like being at a party where everyone else is high and you're not.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is.
Oh God.
Now I'm thinking about the bit in Dirk Gently where the Don at the table talks about how the Book of Revelation shows unmistakable signs of having been written while the author was waiting for the Patmos ferry.
Oh man. I found my old copy of both Dirk Gently books when I was up at my mum's the other week. I was clearing stuff out of the attic and trying to get rid of books, which is difficult. And those were not two I got rid of.
Get rid of books? Sorry, I'm not familiar with this concept.
Anyway. I mean, I'll refer listeners to the previous episodes that we've done on the first two.
I refer the right honourable gentleman to the reply I gave 10 moments ago.
Yeah, that is exactly what I'm doing. We're going to be more exact on parliamentary procedure than the final cut takes any bother of being. We've covered the original miniseries House of Cards from 1990 on a previous episode with Kit, and Kit joined me again for the second installment to play the King, the 93 follow-up, and this is designed for us to chat about the culmination of that series from BBC Television in the mid-90s. This was on in the final cut. The final chapter of the sort of Urquhart saga was on TV in the autumn of 1995 originally. And I was just thinking that because me and Kit have had quite a lot of chance on the previous episodes to talk about our own kind of background with House of Cards and with Ian Richardson and that kind of stuff, I thought we'd probably give Jack first an opportunity to just chat a bit about how he kind of came to them when he first saw them and what he thought of them originally, and then obviously we'll get more of his thoughts on the rewatch later. But how did you encounter House of Cards, Jack?
Right. Well, for one thing, before I answer that question, I have listened to both the previous EscapeGoat podcast episodes about the previous series miniseries in this series. God, terminology is difficult here, isn't it? And I just wanted to tell you, Kit, how much I laughed when I heard you say, now that we've got the vaccines coming, I think by this autumn we'll be pretty much back to normal. I really enjoyed that. That gave me a really good giggle. I'm being very mean to you there. You do caveat the remark very heavily because you're not a naive person.
I think Kit was trying to cheer me up at the time. I think I was feeling very, very pessimistic, and Kit was just giving me some delusion to cling on to.
There's plenty of audio from 2015 of me saying there's no way Hillary loses, so don't worry about it.
Yeah, no,
I've got form for this shit. It's fine.
Well, while we're being honest, there's audio, I think probably of you and I talking, where I say, the number of baffles that just structural baffles that would stop somebody as unstable as Donald Trump getting the presidency. It's not going to happen. Yes, but to actually answer your question, I was a kid who was very interested in politics, and of course, when you're that age, you're not reading proper, because I was very young. You're not reading proper political books. You're sort of feeling your way into the subject through trying to read newspaper articles and pretending you understand them, and watching TV drama and well, the New Statesman largely, to be honest. But television programs about politics, and I think it might have something to do with the fact that I saw somebody's home VHS recording of a very British coup. And that blew my head off, and it still does to this day. But I at some point very early, very young, I decided, I watch political dramas when they come on, when they exist. I watch them. So I watched all this. I watched I watched GBH, Alan Bleasdale's GBH. Mm-hmm. Anybody remember that? I was incredibly too young. Distressingly too young to be watching that, but I watched it. And I watched a thing where it was about prison overcrowding with pre-Hollywood stardom Tom Wilkinson called Underbelly. And I watched House of Cards when it came on, because there was a trailer and it was a political drama. And well, I mean, there was that, and there was also the fact that Susanna Harker was in the trailer, and I just instantly fell hopelessly and completely in love with her, and still am to this day. So that was how I saw the first one, and then so I would have watched it on first transmission, and I didn't record it, but I did watch it first time around, and then I would have watched the others as they came out. Getting a bit older every time, and probably a bit less enthusiastic as they went on. I've watched them. I've rewatched them all now for this, and I watched the original over and over and over again because I had it on video. I had the official BBC VHS release in one of those lovely sort of double plastic boxes, all the 6-part Doctor Who's used to come out in. But I think it must have been cut, because the actual televised version it's 4-hour-long episodes, isn't it? Or they're 50-minute episodes or something. Mm-hmm. And I think the VHS version I had, for some reason, was only 3 hours long. It's like an hour and a half on each tape. Oh. So when I rewatched it recently, like, I don't know, a couple of months ago, there was loads of stuff in there that I didn't really remember, or I faintly remembered it from first time round. And then the VHS version that I'd seen 100 times, it wasn't in there. So I was, and I have to say, it's the first one really holds up, but the second and third one I rewatched for this conversation, and firstly, much less familiar to me because I didn't rewatch them 100 times like I did the first one, and I don't think they hold up anything anywhere near as well as the first one, to be honest with you. But that's it, really. And Ian Richardson became I followed both the main actors from the first one, actually. I followed Susanna Harker everywhere she went, which was a good call, because it ended up with me watching Ultraviolet on Channel 4, which was a brilliant series that a lot of people have forgotten. It's about sort of vampires. It was one of the best fantasy sci-fi shows on television in the 90s. It's not a crowded field, but it was very good.
I've never seen that, but the moment you said it, I was like, vampires popped into my head, so I must have sort of registered it on some marketing level or something.
Yeah. It's Idris Elba's break, if I remember rightly. Because a very, very young Idris Elba is in it, along with Susanna Harker and Jack Davenport. And that's a good show. That is still a good show. That holds up. It's very, 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 very 90s.
Right.
But it's obviously happening in the wake of the X-Files,
Right.
But it is good, and it's a shame it only got one season.
I must look into that. I wonder if that's on BritBox or something. How old were you in 95, Jack?
95, I would have been 19.
Right. Okay. So you know what? I think because I think I mentioned this to Kit on the previous chat. So I also caught bits of the final cut when it was on telly, particularly those last couple of episodes. And it was the first one I saw. I mentioned this in the previous episode. I caught bits of the final cut as kind of my introduction to Urquhart, and but I was 10. I'd just gone 10. So my political, despite other differences in our politics and stuff, my political perception of it would have been very different from yours. It's funny actually you mentioned that the autumn of 95. Watching this, I looked up because obviously Andrew Davis has done tons and tons of TV adaptations and series stuff. I looked up the timing of Pride and Prejudice, and it was also this autumn. It's funny because you mentioned Susanna Harker, who's Jane, isn't she? In that,
yeah. Well, 19 years old. I watched that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, I know what you mean from a 10-year-old perspective. But that was, but yeah, no, I mean, I was just thinking of that actually, because I suppose for a 10-year-old me, that kind of late 90s period is when I was starting to dip my toe into what kind of like tentatively more adult dramas, whatever the definition of that is. And I suppose both these Davis adaptations would qualify as that. I talked on the previous podcast about how, watching Richardson sort of speak to me in the final cut, speak to the audience and speak to me, the conspiratorialness of it was that specific kind of conspiratorialness where adults are telling you something that you're up past the sort of metaphorical watershed for, and probably the actual watershed, So it was interesting for me at that phase of it. But I mean, Kit, you said that the final cut was a sort of particular fascination, because I think for you, unlike Jack, House of Cards, the original series was one that you hadn't revisited too much, right?
That's right. I'd missed House of Cards first broadcast. I can't even remember if I'd seen House of Cards before I saw Final Cut. The first one I saw was Play the King, and I watched it, but I didn't video it. But the Final Cut I was ready for. So I actually owned for many years, perhaps as long as a decade, I had VHS tapes that were recorded from the TV of the Final Cut, and I snapped the thing off so you couldn't accidentally record over them, because I knew I wanted to keep it. I was 17 in 95, and I would have been in my second year of my BTEC in performing arts and the theatre side. And I remember just desperately trying to get anyone else on the theatre course to watch this fucking show, because I watched it I don't know how many times, mainly for Richardson. I think I just was completely, bear in mind at 17 I've still got delusions that I'm going to become an actor, so Richardson just struck me as someone I needed to just absorb absolutely everything he did, because I hadn't seen anything like what he did in that. I mean, the to camera stuff, yes, absolutely, but there's all kinds of stuff in his performance that's really exceptional, really astonishing. So I kind of, I'm embarrassed to describe it this way now, but I did study him, I really did, and I kind of wanted that thing, like there's no evangelist like a 17-year-old evangelist. I wanted everyone on my theatre course to recognize the singular genius of this entire show, and Richardson in particular. So I would just I tried desperately hard to lend the VHSs out to it, and I think I got maybe one or two takers the entire sort of 2 years I was pimping out my VHS copies of Final Cut. I did get a couple of people to watch it, and they did come back and were like, wow, yeah, that was really something. So I think I was obsessed with it on a performance level primarily, although I do think at that age I was probably still naive enough that the politics of it felt kind of resonant as well. It's interesting, I was thinking about this, like it's really hard now to think about what a weird time 95 was in terms of UK politics.
Yeah.
It was so strange because the Tories were still in charge, and they had been in charge for our entire lives. I think all three of us at that point, or it's living memory anyway. Let's say it had been the Tories, and they were still in charge, but they kind of weren't as well, because the majority was down to almost nothing, and John Major was just kind of an embarrassment, and everyone knew they were going to lose whenever they eventually got around to calling an election, and it was just an odd time. It felt. I remember that. I mean, House of Cards as a trilogy, I think we talked about this before, was very lucky, I think, in the timing of the episodes. We talked about the serendipity of the first story. It turned out it ended up airing. I mean, was it the week Thatcher quit or the week
it was
after?
Like, yeah, I think
it was absurdly close, wasn't it?
Right, dead on, yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a similar thing with the final cut, where it really was the kind of the dog days of the Major administration, and everyone knew the time was up, although we didn't know exactly when or how it was going to come. But we knew that the fall was inevitable. We knew that it was kind of, they'd gone past that tipping point in terms of credibility and in terms of popularity, and yet there they were, still in charge, as they always had been. It was a very, very odd time, and I think for me, there was a kind of emotional resonance in that show, in the final cut in particular, that fit very strongly with my sense of where the wider political situation was. And again, that's all through the eyes of a fairly naive 17-year-old,
That's interesting. I think we'll revisit that feeling, that sort of vibe of it. I kind of wanted to turn over to.
That's crucial. Yeah,
I saw some of what you were saying on Twitter about it, Jack. I want to turn over to you again in a sec here. I just wanted to note the sort of slightly strange chronological. I think didn't I refer to it in a previous episode to you, Kit, as like the sort of unit dating controversy of kind of the world of Final Cut. It's not like a mistake or anything, but I suppose the world that Urquhart inhabits in the Final Cut is one where he's been prime minister for over 10 years, right? Because he talked, obviously a lot of it's about the Thatcher legacy and stuff, and we'll talk about that. But that means that this is actually set in a kind of, if you take House of Cards being set in a parallel 1990, this is set in a parallel 2000.
Yeah.
Or 2001, even. It's approaching 9/11.
Yeah.
Which is really odd. Reaching forward. But Jack, I mean, sort of building on what Kit was talking about there at the sort of moment of 1995 and the mid-90s in general. I mean, do you want to sort of expand on that and how you think it contributes to the feel of the final cut?
Yeah, sure. There's so many avenues. The thing is, which one to choose first? I mean, Kit is absolutely right. It is impossible to extricate this from. I mean, it's impossible to extricate any text from the social context of its production, but some texts are so visibly inextricable from their moment, and this really is one of them. I mean, time doesn't work in this universe the same way it does in our universe. This is not taking place in an alternate 2000 or even an alternate 1995. This is taking place in our 1995, because nothing else makes any sense. What's happening is that this is a world where John Major is the prime minister, and somehow we also have this other prime minister at the same time, and the one is just reflected, because it is so completely about the winding down of that eternal Tory rule that started in 79. It's so completely about the slow death of the Major government, and it's about the fall of Thatcher as well, in a way that the first one isn't, because the weird thing about the first one is that it serendipitously coincides with Thatcher's fall, but it's not really about it, because when it was being written and filmed, that hadn't happened. So nobody making it knew how it felt to live in a post-Thatcher world. It was a kind of, well, if she went, what would happen next? What you get in the final cut is it's absolutely saying, well, we all know Major's had it, the Tories have had it, they're going to be gone soon. How can that be? How can that be possible? The government just is a Tory government, isn't it? I mean, that's just how it works forever now. And so it's trying to get to grips with that, but it's also trying to get to grips with the fact that Thatcher went. I mean, this one, Final Cut, is obsessed with Thatcher, and it's really weird the way it's obsessed, but like his obsession with outlasting her, and the ambivalence that he and everybody else seems to have towards her, and the way the end is just crazy when they unveil that statue and everybody starts singing the national anthem, and you're like, who is Margaret Thatcher in this universe?
Well, bear in mind, Urquhart's government have probably made that legally mandatory, you know.
Yeah.
Is she actually the queen, or has she been beatified or something? And so, you know, what is this? What's happening?
Yeah.
And the way she is sort of simultaneous, because, well, I mean, maybe we'll get into this later, but Urquhart is just irresolvably ambiguous in what he means. He is kind of, to me, he is simultaneously this idea of the old-fashioned Tory, where it's all about duty and honor and service and breeding and empire, etc., which is really the opposite of what Thatcher was. I mean, she opportunistically appealed to people who felt that way when she could, but really her coalition was built much more upon the kinds of people that these shows view with contempt, the Charles Collingridges, you know, the guys in Ford escorts from Tedford, you know, who've got startup estate agents, and the middle classes essentially. That,
well, they sneer at Grantham in this, don't they? You know, when
exactly
Elizabeth is talking about it.
Exactly.
Nobody seems to know where that is.
Nobody seems to know.
But this is Thatcher, isn't it? Her whole version of Toryism was that anybody can succeed in this brave new world. As long as you've got the gumption and the nous and the stick-to-itiveness and the enterprise and initiative, etc., all that bollocks. But that was how she sold her project to people. She was happy to wave the flag, but it was all in a much more populist way. It was what Rupert Murdoch did, because Rupert Murdoch's thing was all about how he supposedly hated elites, and his project and Thatcher's project was all about overturning elites, be they old aristocratic elites or union bosses or whoever was in the way at the time, basically. But I mean, Thatcher and her project was hated by some of the old-fashioned Tories. And you guys have talked about this in previous episodes. Urquhart he's just so ambiguous because he seems to be both at once. He seems to venerate Thatcher, and then in this one, he almost hates her. He hates and fears her. He seems to be both the old-fashioned Tory and the arch-Thatcherite. And certainly, when you get into analysing his character, he is sort of superficially, he is the return of something that neoliberalism has left behind, the idea of breeding and status and old families and aristocracy and fixed positions. And at the same time, he is the consummate neoliberal because he just doesn't believe in anything. There is no, politics has no content for Urquhart. There's no question of principle at any stage. It's always about what you want for yourself, what feeds the hole in you, what your power and your ambition. And he doesn't ask himself, when he asks himself why somebody does this, that, or the other, he doesn't say, the idea of it being a question of principle doesn't come into it. No. And he views people who have principles with, it's not even contempt, it's almost like bemused incomprehension. Oh, he believes things. So he is absolutely the consummate neoliberal version of politics, where it's all just process. There's no content, it's just eternal process.
Well, I don't disagree with that in a way, but I think firstly I was just going to note that I think me and Kit said that one of the weird things that Urquhart reaches forward in time to in our real world in a weird way is David Cameron. Like from the Mid-90s perspective, what he kind of, because some of the ways in which you just described Urquhart there could apply to David Cameron, being in a sense the return of the old aristocratic certainties, but coupled with that neoliberal detachment from principle and ideology of any sort at all. But I just also wanted to say that I think Urquhart's just such a strange figure in the way that, does he have a sort of soul, or as he'd say, like a bottom to him or something? Because there's a bit, I noticed this on this rewatch in episode 4 of this. It's kind of at the start of the kind of Cyprus crisis, I guess, that that he's engineered, where he's doing one of the sort of, like, I guess soon to be West Wing style, like, walks down the corridor, and he's talking to us, and he says that something along the line of like, do not mistake me, I feel this sincerely, or something. It's kind of like the power, the nationalist and British pride kind of forces and stuff that he's unleashed, he does to an extent, he feeds off them as well as unleashing them. He can tap into, he can get high on his own supply in a sense, I suppose, which I thought was interesting. I'd never really noticed that before. But sorry, Jack.
I was just going to say, I never get the feeling that he's sincerely in love with nation or queen or country or values or anything like that. To me, he is not a creature of principle. His principles are that he and people like him should rule. That's it.
I mean, it's interesting. I think that, the impression I get is that he's turned on by that, which is not quite the same thing. I appreciate that, but I do feel like I feel like he finds nationalism arousing. I don't know, though, if that's because he knows he can harness it to consolidate power, because he knows that he represents to enough people for it to matter. He represents an embodiment of that kind of power, of that kind of thinking. There is a moment, I think it is in House of Cards, where he says at the bottom of it all is the power, the having, the holding, the grasping. It might have been Play the King, I can't remember, but he has a monologue where he says that out loud, and I agree with that absolutely. Like Urquhart is fundamentally motivated by having power for its own sake, and then what he does with it is just whatever the fuck he wants. That's the point, isn't it? The fun is being able to do that. And interestingly, the other thing that I find fascinating about this one is, in To Play the King, he kind of semi-deliberately picks a fight with the fucking King of England because he's so bored, because he's got total control, total power, and actually the only thing that he starts craving is conflict. And I do like how in this one there does seem to be a stream of like, and now you've bitten off slightly more than you can chew.
There's a sort of kamikaze feel to this whole series in a way, isn't there? He's
really lost his touch in the third one. He makes constant mistakes, and he causes loads of problems for himself. And it's I don't know if it's connected to the fact that we don't. One of the things I miss in the final cut is those moments where Urquhart seems to be talking about his, you couldn't really call it a philosophy, but his aesthetic appreciation of politics.
Yeah.
Urquhart will talk to you like that monologue you just mentioned. In the first two, you will get these moments where he talks about almost this voluptuous, sensual aesthetic of operating in politics and using power, etc. That's not really here. He's kind of empty in this last one. He's not into it anymore. Like in To Play the King, there are bits where he does, he's talking to Sarah and he could be manipulating her, but there are bits where he does genuinely come over as like a reactionary patriot.
Yeah.
Now, whatever you think about that, whatever you think about the tenets of National Socialism, at least it's an ethos. Whatever you think about that, it is a belief. It has political content. Like there are moments in To Play the King where you feel like this is a guy who actually, there is some content to his politics, and it's nationalistic and jingoistic, etc. But whereas in this, he just seems hollowed out, like he has just completely become this creature of process, and he doesn't even enjoy the game anymore.
Yeah, no, I think there is that, but I think also there's the identification in this one of Urquhart with two rural, distant places, right, rather than the heart of London, right? Because he not only, obviously there's the Cyprus thing and Urquhart's own young man boy, experiences in Cyprus, which we'll get into, but also I think this is the one where he explicitly says that he grew up and spent a lot of time in the Highlands as a kid. There's a line where he's like, there was no one around for miles, like there's just kind of, so you've got this kind of weird, I think it adds to the feeling of him being this sort of haunted wraith almost, because he's kind of, you more and more think of him attached to these far away, distant, hilly places, where it's a weird sense that he's not even meant to be there in the heart of it, at the same time as, as you say, he thinks he and people like him should be. It's funny, actually, not to drag it back to your other current projects, but, talking of human bondage, Kit, I was thinking for the first time here, I don't know if it's just because I've watched Skyfall recently, I was thinking that it kind of makes him gives him an odd sort of shared background with James Bond, that kind of, again, when you think of thuggish kind of inherited nationalism,
Yeah. No, I guess, and also like, especially with Craig's Bond, that thing of like the point at which they become an automaton, like they're just forced against their will to jump through the goddamn hoops, because what else is there? And also the appetites, the hollow appetites. That's a really interesting point. I think for me, the moment that really struck me is when he talks about the anecdote of of witnessing badger baiting as a child. And it's a brilliant performance from Richardson, because he manages to both, to me anyway, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but to me it looks like he manages to both express trauma whilst suppressing it. It's like he imagines he's talking about it with a detached distance, and that he's learned the lessons he was supposed to learn from watching that. But it's also clear from the way he delivers it that he's almost in a post-hypnotic state as he's talking. He almost goes back to the trauma while he's describing it. I mean, I spent too much time watching Ian Richardson in Final Cut in particular as an actor, but I think he's moments like that just genuinely, irrespective of the wider issues about the writing or the plotting or anything else. I know we're going to get into that, but it still gives me goosebumps moments like that.
Well, that's
genuinely.
Just quickly, I mean, that's kind of the way. That's also the way he recounts in the final episode his actions as essentially a war criminal to bury the lead to Elizabeth, isn't it? I mean, apart from his voice splitting a bit, you know, but he basically it's like he's reporting to a superior officer or a headmaster, you know. Yeah.
Well, yeah. The relationship between Francis and Elizabeth, I think we're probably have to get into that.
We can't let that go, because I have some questions, you know, insofar as you guys can be a panel that help me with questions that I might have. I have some questions particularly about Elizabeth's presence or absence in the final episode that I think are interesting. You know, I don't think there's really answers to them, but I think it's interesting to speculate about. But I mean, I'm fast realizing that we've got so much to discuss here. This is a bit intimidating. Jack, I just wanted to turn a little bit to, you know, because we've got you on, and to call on your sort of interests and expertise a little bit. Because obviously one thing hanging over this quite a bit is sort of Shakespearean styling and you know, drawing on that vibe and everything. I mean, what did both you as a 19-year-old fan of Shakespeare and you your current self think about the way, I guess, Richardson particularly, but other actors and the plot in general channels that, you know?
Well, when I first saw this, I wasn't yet a fan of Shakespeare. I was 19, so I was, you know, I'd done some Shakespeare at school and college, but I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't call myself the fan that I am now, because I think that's the best word for what I am, to be honest. And I was about to start a university degree. Well, it was the autumn, so I suppose I was into my first year, wasn't I? I just started my first year at university. But yeah, my real enthusiasm and interest for Shakespeare started later. To be honest, it started after I'd been through university. So it started quite a few years after this. So it didn't have much effect upon me at the time. Going back to this now, as I say, for the first time since 1995, what jumps out at me, I mean, loads of things jump out at me with the Shakespeare connection particularly. But one thing in particular is the repeated references to one play in particular, which is Coriolanus, which is one of the lesser known of the tragedies. It's undergone something of a revival in recent years. There's been a movie, Ralph Fiennes did a movie, etc. Not, in my opinion, a particularly good movie, but never mind. But it is, and it's had a bit of a revival on stage over the last couple of decades, but it's still not. It's not one of the biggies. You know, people would struggle to you know, remember big lines from it and stuff like that. But lines from Coriolanus appear repeatedly in this. There is a world elsewhere is a line that is repeated twice, and that is a line from Coriolanus. There's another line, there's a bit where he refers to somebody as a boy of tears. That's a line. I wondered where that Coriolanus came from. Yeah. That's from Coriolanus.
I've been meaning to look that up for about 20 years. So.
Yeah.
So thank you.
The phrase "you approve our choice," that's from Coriolanus. Coriolanus is a fascinating play. Somebody once said, I think it was William Cobbett, that you can save yourself the trouble of reading both Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution and Paine's response, The Rights of Man, by just reading Coriolanus, because it puts both sides of the argument. I didn't quite go that far, but obviously it's a rhetorical way of making a point, and it does. It is a deeply political play. It is about for in case people don't know, and it is a lesser known play. It is about a Roman general, Caius Marcius, who is incredibly aggressive and successful in Republican. This is before the empire. This is before Julius Caesar, etc. Republican Rome's wars with neighboring city-states, in particular a city-state called Coriolis. And he essentially whoops their asses and gets himself given the honorary name Coriolanus. Now, he is then chosen by the patricians of Rome to be the new consul. But because Rome is what it is, that choice has to be approved by the people, because this is pre-empire. There is a degree of republican democracy. Obviously, it's not democracy as we would recognize it, but he has to, and it's kind of a formality. He just has to go out into the street and talk to the common people and show them his wounds. That's all he has to do. Wounds that he acquired in the service of Rome, right? And he can't do it. He is so proud and so incapable of tolerating judgment on the part of others. And he is such a raging, ferocious snob about ordinary people that he cannot handle it. And he's also, there's a wonderful BBC production where Alan Howard plays Coriolanus, and he plays all that, but he also plays him as fundamentally shy. And the bit where he's in the town square and sort of citizens are approaching him and saying, "Can we see those wounds?" Then he's desperately embarrassed, and he can't handle it. And the tribunes, who in the Roman Republican system, the tribunes were like, they were the people who were of the ruling class, but they were elected by the people to represent them in the government. And these two tribunes, who are presented as these cynical Machiavellian people, they sabotage Caius Marcius's bid to become consul by whipping up the people who are presented as like this easily led, malcontented mob. Although, Shakespeare being as ambiguous as always, they get to state their case, and their case is actually, pretty good about why they resent the ruling class, etc. But the tribunes whip the people up against Caius Marcius. The people protest his election to consul, and Coriolanus doesn't take that very well. And what he as he flounces out, he says, there's a couple of brilliant lines. First, they banish him. They banish him from Rome because he's dangerous, because he hates the people so much. This is what the tribunes have managed to get happen. And as he flounces out, he says, "I banish you." And then he says, there's this wonderful line where he says, "There is a world elsewhere." And that is the line that is repeated in Final Cut. Mm-hmm. So the fact that they chose to harp on, because the first one references Macbeth and Richard III, obviously. The fact that they go from that to Coriolanus, where you have the tragic figure, he doesn't really want power particularly. It's like he's been maneuvered into a situation where he's supposed to take it. He has his mother Volumnia is this incredibly dominant figure, and she, along with several other characters, kind of tell him that he has to want to be the consul and he has to want to run the government, etc. He doesn't really want to, but because he feels like he has to, he makes this half-hearted bid for power, and he gets frustrated by essentially popular democracy, because he is such a snob. He is so of the elite. He hates the common people so much. He resents their presence in government so much that he cannot play politics. So, the thing that makes him a great general, that he just attacks uncompromisingly, makes him a terrible, terrible politician, because he's incapable of compromise. And I think, so he engineers through sort of trying to get this job he doesn't even really want. He's just elbowed into it. He engineers his own banishment and ruin, and then he attacks his own polity, having allied with forces from outside it. And then at the last minute, because he is fundamentally a weak person, he's talked out of it by his wife and his mother, who come and plead with him, "Please don't destroy Rome." And then his new ally Aufidius says, "You've gone back on our deal," and the people of Coriolis, I'll play it safe, the people of Coriolis, they kill him, and that's his tragedy. And it's fascinating to me, because I think one of the things you see repeatedly in this version of Urquhart is that he's become weak. He has become dithering. He has become self-sabotaging. He's no longer good at playing the Machiavellian politics. He doesn't really seem to believe anything. He creates problems for himself, and he just gives off in wave. He's the anecdote about the badger baiting. What he's saying is, the blood is in the water. Yep. I'm the badger. I'm doomed. And I think what he's actually saying is, that's fine. I've had enough. But because he really does come across as incredibly immature and juvenile. He's a juvenile bully, and he's childish and weak in this one. And it really, I think the invocation of Coriolanus is really apt, because Coriolanus is about this guy who, as I say, he doesn't really want to be doing this, and he's trapped in this situation where he has to, despite the fact that he's really not suited for politics. And that's kind of what this one is saying. Ultimately, it's saying, weirdly, it's a weird conclusion to come to, but the weird conclusion it's coming to is Francis Urquhart not really cut out for politics.
That's so interesting, and that's obviously not knowing the play at all. That's not an angle I would ever have brought to it, and that's interesting.
I should have issued a spoiler warning before I told you the plot.
I think Shakespeare's outside spoiler warnings now, generally, but for better or for worse. I'll turn it back to you in a sec, Kit, but I was just thinking, we were joking around about the ghost of Tim Stamper, and about I think you can imagine a version of this that went a bit more fully theatrical, and because this is such a haunted finale and such a haunted version of Urquhart, it could actually feature ghosts without much stretching of the theatrical format, and that might be.
He has the same nightmares that Richard III starts having at the end of the play.
Yes, that's what you want. I wasn't even going to patronize you by bringing the Richard III thing up. Obviously, that's kind of entry level stuff. But but all I wanted to say is, you talk about him maybe not being cut out for where he's ended up, and having this kind of suicidal ideation, I guess, or political suicidal ideation. The scenes where he's dealing, particularly with Geoffrey Boozer Pitt in all his glory, they made me think that what he's doing, and those are the bits, Kit, where I was saying, you were joking, can you see Stamper's ghost in all the scenes? And I was like, in those scenes, I can, standing at his shoulder, because he's kind of playing with Boozer Pitt as the chief whip would have used to.
Yeah,
in a sense, he's doing things that are beneath him a little bit here. It's kind of even when Pitt is his, one of the most powerful ministers in his cabinet, ridiculously, he's like, he enjoys it. This doesn't speak well to him as a character or as to a morality. It's just that he kind of enjoyed torturing people as chief whip, and that makes him one of the dogs, right, to the badger.
Yeah, and I mean the whole of his character arc, I mean the whole of the first series is him realizing that he doesn't have to just be chief whip. He can take that model, that approach, and it can take him all the way, right? And we can't ignore the role of Elizabeth in that. She's the catalyst for the entire trilogy. She's the one who says to him, you're twice the man he is. You could do this. And I love how that's echoed in this series, where he, angrily, almost querulously, and this ties into what you were saying, Jack, adolescently says, I'm twice the man here. The way he delivers it, it's very clear. Like, if you need to say that out loud, mate, we all know you're not. Like it's a classic kind of bit of sort of bully bravado, which I find that fascinating. The thing I'm always reminded of is this is so Jack's giving you the Shakespeare connection, but concerning Lethal Weapon 4, which is just a terrible movie, but the running gag in Lethal Weapon 4, of course, is Mel Gibson turning to Danny Glover and saying repeatedly, "We're not too old for this shit." Because they've got enough, they've realized, well, we've been making this movie for 10 years and Danny Glover was retiring at the end of the first one. So this is, and that's like, it's a running gag throughout the movie. We're not too old for this shit. We're not too old for this shit, And I feel like that's really, that's exactly what's going on with Urquhart in the final cut. I mean, transparently what's going on with him. But that whole thing, that whole thing is fascinating. I think I really do feel, I mean, we've got to bear in mind that the source material was written by a Tory. I'm always fascinated by that fact. And I know that the TV series does differ from the source material in certain ways, but a lot of it doesn't. I mean, the core of Urquhart's character, I would argue, is there on the page, even in the novels. And I've read the novel of the final cut, so I can maybe speak to that at some point if that's interesting. But
that will be interesting, because I haven't. I've read the first two novels. I have very faint memories of them, but I know I've read them, but I haven't read the third one.
Yeah, I can't recommend it. but then I can't recommend what I think we discussed this when we did To Play the King. I think I read the first couple of chapters of To Play the King, and I was just like, no, I can't do this.
Yeah. But it's always been my impression that, I mean, you can confirm this or deny it, but it's always been my impression that these TV series are authored very much more by Andrew Davis than by Michael Dobbs.
I think it's at least 50-50 in the sense of the input and the kind of mood and tone of them and the regard of Toryism in them.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's right. But I think that for me, where the Toryism comes in is in the kind of psychology of the characters, and Urquhart's no exception in this, in that there is a fatalism to it. There is a real sense of like that this is just the inevitable shape. I mean, it's that classic line, right? All political careers end in failure. That's why this particular part of the show, the final part of the trilogy, is obsessed with Thatcher even more than the first one was. It's precisely because of that. Thatcher's career ended in failure, arguably. I mean, she was booted out ultimately. We know from the title, we know from the opening that this is Urquhart's final story. It has to be. So it has those elements of inevitability to it. But I think I feel like there's something about, I'm really going to screw this up because I'm extemporizing far too much, but there's something about the Tory worldview that has this kind of baked in fatalism to it. There's all this stuff about the nature of man and the nature of men and the nature of types of men. And Urquhart is I think Urquhart is an archetype. I mean, that's maybe why, when we've discussed like none of his motivations or behaviors fully add up, it's because he's not a man, he's an avatar of an ideal of a very particular kind of Toryism. Of course, he's also a nightmare of a very particular kind of Toryism. That's another thing I find fascinating about Urquhart as a character. He is quintessentially Tory in many important respects, but he's also, even in the novels, written by a Tory as a nightmare Tory. So there's an incredible anxiety in there, I think, that Urquhart represents, an anxiety in the psyche of Toryism, or at least the Tory that wrote these novels, which is just really interesting, I think.
Yeah, it really, I mean, I agree with you. I think there's something about right-wing politics which just has that kind of fatalism, because it has this fundamental cynicism and pessimism about humanity kind of built into it, and I think he's a fantasy figure, really, and the fact that Toryism, particularly Thatcherite Toryism, creates as a fantasy figure a mass murdering psychopath.
I think Daddy comes back in this, of course, doesn't it? Not just on the tape from Matty Storian, but Elizabeth invokes it as well.
Yeah, but I think just that fundamental kind of pessimism and fatalism overwhelms the fantasy, doesn't it? And I think that's kind of, that's kind of happening on two levels. It's happening within the text, but it's also happening to Urquhart himself. Like, he has achieved his fantasy, and it's kind of, what all the way through this last one, he strikes me as somebody trying to recreate past glories, and weirdly, the thing he spends most of his time trying to recreate are like these epic struggles and these friendships that he had. It's very, but like Jeffrey Boozer Pitt strikes me as kind of his weird indulgence for this essentially completely useless person who is, they're not on the same page in terms of the sociopathic morality, because although he's not in any way a good person or bothered as much as he should be, Jeffrey Boozer Pitt is the kind of person who can look at gunned down schoolgirls and not be happy about it. Whereas, so they're not on the same page there, and he's actively a hindrance, and yet Urquhart elevates him, and he does it with kind of this surface patina of, well, I'm doing it to wind people up. It's a troll, essentially. But what it looks like more to me is that he's trying to recreate the friendship with Stamper, and the thing with Claire Carson, that looks like an attempt to recreate the past glories of, with Matty and Sarah. But very, very tellingly, he doesn't even manage to sleep with Claire.
I tell you what's incredible. I will drop this in from the novel. So one of the closing scenes towards the end of the novel, by the way, in a weird way, although the novel also ends up with Urquhart dead, Urquhart also wins. But maybe I'll get into that later when we talk about the final scenes. But there's a wonderful, like genuinely, I love this moment in the novel where Urquhart lays out his grand finale plan, or most of it, to Claire, and then he actually makes a move on her. And she says, "Oh no, Francis, that's not appropriate." And he says something along the lines of, and there's this line where it says like Urquhart was disappointed he'd planned on taking her across his desk as a final victory celebration or something like that, which is just like, okay, thanks for that image. And then, but then he says to her, did I misread your mood, or did I misread, forgive me, I thought there was something there, or I thought there was a spot. I mean, he says it better than that, but he says, I thought that you were interested in me. Was I wrong? And she said, no, you weren't wrong about that, but you are wrong about the timing, and timing is everything. And that's her last line in the novel. And then she leaves him in number 10. So yeah, the novel makes it even more explicit. Like he can't seal the deal this time.
To his loving credit, on the commentary for the DVD of Final Cut, Richardson himself kind of looks at, I think it's one of Claire's bed scenes with Makepeace, and kind of goes, I can't remember if he says if the decision came from Andrew Davis or whatever, but he's like, they told me I was not going to be sleeping with this one, and I must say I was a little bit relieved. Like, I think because he seems to have just been thinking, I told you that anecdote, didn't I, Kit, on the first one where he met Susanna Harker's real life dad.
Yeah,
and already thought it was weird then, and then he was just like, I probably shouldn't be doing this anymore, and as an actor. So that was kind of lovely.
But the Boozer Pitt thing is fascinating, because my favorite, I think the most telling line with Boozer Pitt is when he cheerfully turns to his wife and says, he's one of us, Elizabeth. And it's like, no, he fucking isn't, and he isn't, and she knows he isn't. And it's a really fascinating moment, because Stamper was whatever else Stamper was one of them.
I'll tell you what Jeffrey Boozer Pitt is. He's the only one of them around him who'll pretend he likes him.
Yeah, there you go.
He's like a jester, isn't he? He's kind of like his pet. No, you know what he is? He's Salacious Crumb from Return of the Jedi. He's just sat on Jabba's shoulder.
I was going to say he's like the fool from Lear, but the fool genuinely likes the old man.
There's a lot of Johnson in him. Do you not think?
Well, he's very.
That's a good point, actually. Yeah,
he's
Seriously.
very David Mellor, isn't he? I mean, we were talking about the context of the major years. There's even a line like the bit where they have the conversation about this looming sex scandal, and he talks about, it's nothing. It's just uniforms, which is a direct reference to David Mellor and Antonio de Sancho and Chelsea strips, etc., etc.
Oh yeah, this is the era of is it like Back to Basics and the sort of all the sleaze scandals and stuff.
Family values,
absolutely. Back to basics, while manila envelopes are flying back and forth, and sleaze. I mean, that was the buzzword. Yeah.
It's interesting we got into Jeffrey Boozer Pitt there, because I think let's take a very brief break, and because then I want to steer you guys on to talking about some, because again, far too much to cover here, but maybe if we talk about some of the other characters that we've barely talked about yet, I think that might tease out some of the interesting things again about kind of the mood of the piece and kind of the assumptions it makes, and the places it goes and the places it doesn't go. Does that sound okay?
Yeah,
totally.
Great.
That's good to me.
I want to be remembered as the greatest Prime Minister since Winston Churchill.
And you will be, Francis.
He's won so many times, he thinks he's indestructible.
I think it's time to ginger things up a bit. Remind them who's the leader of the pack.
There should be a full inquiry.
Oh, absolutely.
I'd like you to consider me for the job. I'd love to do it, and I think I'd do it very well.
Well, Mrs. Carson, it's very kind of you to make yourself available.
The Final Cut starts tomorrow at 9 on BBC One.
You might very well think that. I couldn't possibly comment.
Welcome back. So guys, I just wanted to sort of zero in on some of the other characters that we've not really talked about yet, in the hope that we'll cover some more ground with them, and maybe talk a bit more about what makes the show and this final iteration of the show distinctive and interesting, and flawed probably as well. I wanted to talk about Makepeace first, because that's something. I mean, I had a few sort of thoughts about that this time around that I hadn't had on previous watches, because I think I didn't really mention, but I think for me it's probably been about a good 5-6 years since I watched this last. I have actually rewatched this several times over my life, but it's been a while. And there were a few things I noticed, some of them, from everything to do with like in-depth character stuff to do with like parliamentary procedure and its rabid violation this time around. But I just wanted to talk, I guess starting with yourself, Jack, about, because we already talked a bit about the sort of historical moment of, where I guess, Toryism and where that kind of conception of government was in the mid-90s in the UK. What are your thoughts about Makepeace as a I guess like the kind of big bad for Urquhart in some ways?
Well, again, I don't. This is absolutely happening in the context of the winding down into doom of the Major years, but this is fundamentally not about the downfall of Major. This is more about, to the extent that it's about anything other than itself, it's about the downfall of Thatcher. So Makepeace is much more in line with those those formerly loyal Thatcherite ministers who jumped ship and caused her no end of problems at the end. Particularly, I would say the business with Makepeace's devastating speech. That is I think that's very definitely a reference to, I think it was Douglas Hurd, wasn't it? Gave the devastating speech from the green benches, where that is widely considered. Hurd's anti-Thatcher speech is widely considered to be one of the big factors leading to, it was the blood in the water moment, one of them anyway. So yeah, I think that's I mean, I hate saying this because I no shade on Paul Freeman, but he is totally miscast in this role. He's too old to play this character, and the way people talk about Tom Makepeace doesn't mesh with Tom Makepeace on screen. Because it's Paul Freeman, and Paul Freeman's a good actor, but I don't know why they cast him for this. I think maybe it's because he's just got this this air of benevolence about him, I suppose. What they're trying to get at, I think, is kind of this idea of like the right guy, the good guy, the man of principle. I mean, obviously he's a flawed person, but even like his affair turns out to not be something he's doing behind his wife's back. He and his wife have an open marriage. So, you get the sense that he genuinely cares about the business with the Greek chap and his daughter and the murdered young Greek men, etc. The impression you get throughout it is that this is essentially a man of principle, and I think it's I don't know. This is the first time I've seen it in a long time. There might be dimensions I'm missing, but I feel like it's a slightly naive narrative about if we could just get the right guy back in, just get content back into politics, moral content back into politics. And I don't know if this was a conscious thing, but if you link that up with like vengeful retaliatory speeches by Heseltine and Hurd against Thatcher because their ambitions were thwarted, I think that's a very odd flex from where I'm sitting.
Yeah, I just want to turn this back into Kit in a sec, but I was just thinking one of the ways which is interesting from both from our today perspective and from the 95 perspective, is one of the ways in which he's kind of quote unquote morally better than Urquhart, or a better modern Tory, say, is that he has a basic level of diplomatic respect for the nations of Europe, doesn't he? Which is like, something that Urquhart's I think Urquhart's actually, he's channeling in power Thatcher a bit there, but he's more channeling kind of post power Thatcher
absolutely
as well, isn't he? And what was seen to work there. But Kit, what I wanted to say to you is, do you remember I think To Play the King in particular, but in Final Cut as well, in House of Cards as well, we were talking about the kind of absence of an opposition, or in the sense in To Play the King, obviously you meet the opposition leader, but he's obviously bolstered and kind of a prop for the king in the sense, they have to create another opposition out of to face Urquhart that can't be the Labour leader of the opposition, and this takes that even further, doesn't it, with Makepeace?
No, absolutely, and I think that if he's again, it's that Tory. Well, it's the old joke, isn't it? The Blues Brothers joke in the bar, but it's the conservative politics joke. We've got both kinds of politics, conservatism and liberalism, and it is that joke again personified. The Labour MPs exist purely to have northern accents and make jokes about Sooty. That's literally the only kind of character they have beyond that. Their questions are irrelevant because what they have to say is irrelevant because they'll never be in power because they're not the right sort of chap to be in power. And
they seem to have made Makepeace from like episode 3 onwards. They seem to have made Makepeace literally leader of the opposition in sense of he gets to question and then counter question Urquhart.
That would explain why he gets 3 questions when he's just a backbencher in the opposition. Which otherwise one might suggest doesn't make a huge amount of sense. I mean, I think to answer the casting question, I think it's just because he looks enough like Heseltine. I think it's the hair and the eyes. I think I think he was transparent. I mean, you're right, obviously, Jack, you're absolutely right. The speech was heard. That was 100%. I mean, I'm willing to bet that they sat down with Heard's speech and then rewrote it to make it more about, the plot of the show. But it's absolutely transparently the Heard moment. But that said,
except that it's better than Heard's speech, because Andrew Davies is a much better writer than whoever used to write speeches for Douglas fucking Heard. But never mind.
Yeah, and it's delivered better as well, because guess what? That's what happens when you have a trained actor. It turns out that Paul Freeman can deliver a speech if you give him one. And so I think for me, that's the answer to the casting question, except also, I think it's another exposure of what I would call the Tory pathology, because I'm, not a Tory, which is the idea that it's the myth of the good Tory. You know what I mean? Like the myth that there is a compassionate conservatism, there is a way of doing this thing. Like we're not the monsters they say we are, and that we understand that you've got to have the free market doing what it does in order to unlock potential for everybody. Blah blah blah, and all this kind of incoherent bullshit. But I think that I think probably that's why he doesn't work, because he represents that. He represents that position. It's just unfortunately that position is completely politically and indeed morally incoherent.
Well, you see in real life, obviously in real politics at the moment, not to get too into that, you sort of see Johnson trying to inhabit that role, and you also see Sunak kind of auditioning for it, don't you? From the obviously he's a front bencher, so it's not the same thing as challenging from the back benches. But you see that we think of it as the myth of the good Tory because we're left wingers, but like the even for Tories, the ideal of the good Tory is this mithril vest in which they all try and try on in various ways.
Well, yeah, and the way they all the whatever's left of the moderate wing of the Tory party, which as we know isn't very much, they were effectively purged in the last general election by Johnson. But there is this kind of, I mean, they the way they talk about Rory Stewart as like the kind of king across the water. It's the way Labour centrists used to talk about David Miliband. It's the same sort of thing where it's just like this, because he can string a coherent sentence together, and because he can look really sad and thoughtful when he talks to someone who's poor. And it's like, okay, well, great, that's really an improvement. But I mean, I think for me that's what's going on with Makepeace, and that's why I agree that the character doesn't quite work. I like the performance, and I can watch Paul Freeman I think pretty much all day, because he does have, you're right, he has that charisma, and he has that, and again, don't you think there's echoes of the King into Play the King in his character, that kind of that kind of essential decency, whatever the fuck that actually means.
Something must be done was the phrase that kept going back to me.
Something must, there you go, exactly. Yeah, there's something must be done energy is
this seems, I don't know whether this comes from Dobbs or from Davies, I suspect, but there just seems to be this thing in all these where the decent guy is just inherently kind of a bit hapless and useless, because you have John and then the Collingridge brothers in the first one, and then in the second one, of course, you have the King, and in this one you have Makepeace. And the odd thing about Makepeace is that he wins, and he kind of, I mean, it's not true that he wins by accident. He plays a pretty good game, as it turns out. It's really the first instance of a decent guy actually turning out to be a decent politician in this entire series, because otherwise it just seems like, to the writer, an integral part of decency is not being good at politics.
Which is fair.
Well, I mean, that's interesting, because there is an ambiguity in Makepeace's character, because I mean, I don't know, one of the scenes that I really like is actually when he's sitting there talking to the woman about her, about her father, and perhaps these people who have gone missing, perhaps were killed. I actually think, I think you do see the cogs starting to turn for Makepeace in that moment. I think you do see him realize that, yeah, I mean, yes, it is the right thing to do, but he knows he's making political hay out of that. Yeah. He knows that there's
he's being tempted in a sort of religious sense, almost, don't you?
Yeah, I think so. I think because the way he speaks about it makes it very clear that he is absolutely thinking about the political fallout and impact of that. And he realizes crucially, he realizes there's absolutely no downside for him. Like there is just none whatsoever. And he almost pursues it because he knows it's making Urquhart uncomfortable, and that makes it reason enough to do.
And he seems to pick up on something about Urquhart, which is that Urquhart kind of has this immature streak, and he seems to repeatedly goad Urquhart into showing it. I mean, funnily enough, the thing that tips him into outright, no, I've had enough of this, is the thing Urquhart says at the dispatch box about a single European language, and of course it has to be English. Now that is so it's parodic, it's a troll, but it's too much.
But even Urquhart knows it is though, right?
Yeah, absolutely. He's not being serious. He's just amusing himself. But that itself is kind of juvenile. He's just doing it to amuse himself because he's bored. So he says the most outrageous thing. It's sort of, comment section edgelordy, isn't it? But Makepeace is he can't handle it. And how much of that is actually sort of wounded vanity about him being robbed of credit for the diplomatic triumph, etc., etc. But it is his tipping point. But the thing that the way in which he manages to transform that is that he kind of gets to grips with the fact that Urquhart does have this incredibly immature streak, and he starts bringing it out. He starts deliberately goading Urquhart at the dispatch box,
and he nicks his catchphrase.
Yeah.
That's such a great moment.
She responds, "You,"
which is well, that's a real subtextual emasculation, isn't it? That's the cucking of Francis Urquhart. But no, he goads him into these sort of childish, petulant responses, and then he no-sells them. And Urquhart has this problem that a lot of people with entrenched power have, which is that he's surrounded by people who are prepared to say, "No, you did great. He looked stupid," no matter what the truth is.
That's right.
He keeps on having these exchanges with Makepeace where Makepeace looks like the grown-up. And then he goes behind the scenes, so to speak, and whoever he's talking to will say, no, you were fantastic. Because Urquhart never really, he sort of formally understands, but he never grapples with the fact that Claire is just completely unprincipled, and she will say whatever the person she's talking to wants to hear. He knows it intellectually, but he never really, not me. She's not fooling me, obviously, and she is.
Yeah,
I'm so glad to have you link it back to Claire there, because I wanted to move on to Claire, but I also but before we move on from Makepeace, I think there's a couple of segues here. First, I just wanted to make the observation that you could say that the most interesting thing about Makepeace is his wife, and not just in a in a sort of knee-jerk feminist way, but in a way that they're a mirror for Urquhart and Elizabeth, aren't they? They're kind of, they're another view. Like Kit even mentioned the open marriage thing, or Jack, you mentioned the open marriage thing. They are a sign of how that can work differently, but I say work, in inverted commas, because obviously the marriage is collapsing, but seemingly quite amiably,
That's one of the things I like most about Final Cut, actually, the way it redirects that, because the first time you see them, you think, oh, this is going to be another story about, he's cheating on his wife and she's the betrayed, and as it unfolds, you realize that she's this woman with her own literary career and her own boyfriend, and in the end she dumps him, and she does it very kindly and regretfully, but she's the one who realizes, we've outgrown each other. I've got my own shit now.
It's set up to be another Patrick Walton, isn't it? As you say, from the first series.
It's like, you're going to be a great prime minister, Tom, but I'm going to be off with John.
My favorite is her line when she leaves him and she says, "He needs me and you don't." I love that. I love that. Like, there's an emotional honesty at the core of that.
Yeah.
And again, it's the way she delivers it is perfect, because you could do that with the kind of angry, petulant, whatever, and that could be a devastating line, actually.
Yeah. No, the actress. I don't know the actress's name, sadly, but she gives a really great, quiet little performance. It's very convincing. There's a lovely moment where they kind of just have this little momentary reminiscence about something. We don't even know what it is, but there's a word that goes back and forth between them. Do you remember whatever it is? And they
some restaurant they went to or something.
Yeah, it's a really truthful human moment. It's great. It's really well sold.
The reason sorry, Kate,
I was just going to say she's superb. The following year, I think it's the following year after this, that she's in season 2 of Cracker in the Big Crunch. And she's absolutely stunning in that.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, I remember this now as well, because I also watched that earlier this year. The Sickness Spreads.
Totally different character. And totally different played in a totally different way as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know what? I think, Jack, you said about Makepeace as a character, and I guess the actor portraying him being a bit too old in some ways to convey the side of the character that should be the young pretender, the young candidate for change. It's interesting, actually, because I think some of this might come from Davis, because I do remember on the commentary or one of the attendant interviews, Davis, I think, making the point that, with the sex scenes with Claire and Makepeace, that he was trying to deliberately kind of like bust some taboos, I guess, in the sense of portraying like passionate sex between older people.
Yeah, and that's good. I haven't got anything against that at all. And I do kind of like the implication of this guy as sort of a bit of an it's a kind of a maturation story for Makepeace. This is almost round the back. This is almost like Makepeace's origin story as prime minister, as statesman, because he's quite an immature person in many respects. He's like this big kid. Well, one of the repeated refrains in Coriolanus is male immaturity, and Coriolanus gets called boy as an insult, and he absolutely loses his shit when you do that, because of course secretly he understands that he is just this big overgrown kid. And so there's a sense in which ultimately Makepeace is the one who is kind of an overgrown kid, but he can get past that, and Urquhart can't.
I suppose so. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to, that idea of sort of childlike regression, I suppose, because his wife, Makepeace's wife, talks about him as being like a little boy, doesn't she?
Yeah,
and I think Claire, whether she's telling the truth or not, mentions him that way to Urquhart, and that's where the daddy thing comes back again. I think I don't know if Claire uses the word in that point, but talking about him wanting his father's approval and everything, meaning Urquhart.
Yeah. But it's also that she likes him because he's like a little boy. I think that's part of what she likes about him, because it's almost impossible to tell what Claire really thinks about anything. But I think Isla Blair is playing her as genuinely liking him, as like a boyfriend. She'd sell him down the river to get what she wants, but she does like having sex with him. She likes hanging out with him, and I think that is kind of just the fact that he's boyish. He's like this big kid, and she gets to be his mummy.
Yeah, and as Mrs. Makepeace says, some women like that.
Yeah, she does actually. She puts her finger right on it. Yeah,
that sort of infantilizes Claire as well in her absence, doesn't it? Kind of, well, not infantilizes exactly, but it makes her into a sort of a type, which Mrs. Makepeace isn't.
But again, there's another callback to Coriolanus, because the central relationship in Coriolanus is between Caius Marcius and his dominating mother, who is much. He has a wife and a son, but he's married to his mother in that play.
Well, we could, we'll definitely talk about Elizabeth and Corder kind of right at the very end. But you could argue with it. This is Francis's story of that as well. But Kit, I just wanted to. I mean, do you think, because obviously we talked a great deal about Matty and Sarah before, do you think? I'll leave it as a big question, I guess, and you just answer it any way you interpret. But do you think Claire works?
I mean, she works for me. I think mainly in the performance. It's interesting how I realize I'm not sure I do understand. I was going to say I'm not sure I understand which side Claire's on. I think Claire isn't on any side, and I think that's really interesting. I think Claire is on Claire's side. I think Claire is attracted to power, and I think in that sense, it's fascinating in that she'll say contradictory things, and she'll deliver those contradictory things with complete conviction,
because she sort of believes both of them.
And I like that, actually. I think that's really kind of cool. I think my favorite moment with Claire, I think the line that for me is the key to her character, is when Makepeace splits up with her, and she says, "I always thought it would be me that ended it." And for me, that's the essence of Claire, because it's the one moment where she does appear to show some kind of genuine human frailty. The rest of the time, it always feels like she's completely in control of everything she's saying and everything she's doing. Now, that could have been a line as well. That could also be a manipulation. But it doesn't feel like one in the moment, because she does seem genuinely upset that they're breaking up. And I think that, and I agree with Jack's read that whatever else is going on or not going on, she enjoys sleeping with Makepeace. I think that is real, absolutely. And I mean, God, there's a wonderful line where she's got the interview with Urquhart, and she says we're very in tune or whatever, and the look on Francis's face.
Yeah. That sort of audition scene is great. Yeah.
Oh, it's fantastic. I mean, it's probably the best of those audition scenes, both because of the stakes are so high for both of them, and because she's weirdly, at the same time, she's stronger and more capable and more vulnerable than the other two candidates were, because the other two candidates were both young and they were both in their way naive, and they both were playing completely outside of their comfort zone, actually, because one of them's a journalist. Well, one of them's a journalist. The other is she's a pollster, right, and an opinion, but she's not a politician. But Claire is, Claire is embedded in the political process, and she has been clearly for a long time. So she's not naive in the way the other two were, but she's also in some ways more vulnerable because she's having this affair. And she knows that Urquhart knows she's having this affair. And I mean, that's another, we were talking earlier about Urquhart losing it and displays of that. Actually, that scene's a really good embodiment of that, where he does this whole thing about like, but what if I didn't know? And blah, 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 blah. And it's like, no, motherfucker, she's got you, man. She knows you know. You wouldn't ask the question. And you're indulging this fantasy that you actually have put her at risk. And the way she responds to that is great because she knows. She knows the game that's being played. She knew the second she sat down, she was going to have to answer that question.
And as you said, I think it was one of you hinted before, like the fact that he can't sense that anymore correctly.
Yeah,
I want to get back to this when we talk about Elizabeth, actually, because I think it's interesting that the one he doesn't sleep with is also the one that, as they make a point of in the dialogue, that Elizabeth didn't pick or sort of usher into him his presence.
That is interesting. Just one thing in response to what Kit said, which is, I see this as very. I mean, the context of it, which is the decline of the Major years. Thatcher's gone. Major is sort of Thatcherism in continuance, but decline. It's zombie Thatcherism. And then, Blair is around the corner, and essentially the politics of neoliberalism continued. I mean, Thatcher is not a failure in that sense because she changes the Labour Party. She always said that was her greatest achievement. Yep. But it's a different kind. It's a different aesthetic and procedural way of practicing Thatcherism or neoliberalism, we should say. But it is this moment where these issues are. It's a moment of transition. And hence, this story is just obsessed with negotiating and interrogating these questions of politics as content or process. It's absolutely about that. And so many of the characters have aspects of both. As I said, Urquhart is ambiguous because there are aspects of him where he is politics as content. And there's another sense in which he is absolutely just politics as process, where it's all about, winning for no real reason, just the process of winning. And, different characters go back and forth, make pieces, sometimes one and the other, Urquhart sometimes one and the other, etc., etc. The thing about Claire is that she's actually pure process. There's no content there at all. And there was with both Matty and Sarah. Matt, for all that they're both ambitious, etc., they both had opinions. They both had beliefs, right? Even, Sarah has quite strong opinions. You don't quite ever find out what Matty's are, but they're definitely, she has a moral sense, etc. She has opinions about who'd be the best man for the job, etc. Sarah has actual developed political opinion, but Claire doesn't have opinions. She has personal feelings and personal reactions and judgments of what's beneficial to her at any given time. Even her emotions, they're real, but they're completely self-contained and conditional. I think that the scene where she talks to Urquhart about how much she hates Tom now, I think in that moment she absolutely means it. The next time she sees Tom, she doesn't feel that way anymore because it's pure process. It's just, at this point he's inconvenienced me, so I hate him. And then there's a bit later where I think I can use him again, so I like him again. She is like the embodiment of this thing that's happening to politics, where it's being stripped of all content, it's being emptied, it's being reduced to pure process. And so Urquhart, who is not quite that, he does have some content in there. He can't deal with that. He can't quite get his head around it, and consequently he can't use it. He can use those bits of content that are there in Matty and Sarah. He can grab hold of them and exploit them. With Claire, there's nothing to exploit. There's just nothing there. She's kind of like the monster that he created,
She is, but I think there's also a really interesting gender dimension there as well, because I think that with Sarah and Matty, I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? They're both very strong. That we know instinctively that they have principles, that they have content, but we're not sure what it is. Why do we know they have content? Well, isn't it just because they're women?
Well, I think
women are inherently more likely to have emotions and principles and blah, blah, blah. I mean, I'm talking in terms of like the way the fiction is written.
Sure. I think there's an element of that with Matty. I think Sarah actually voices, if I remember rightly, she voices quite well-developed political opinions. They're rather unpleasant and elitist.
Shit. But
horrid.
But they are... again, at least it's
privatizing social workers. That's her opening.
But it comes from somewhere. She's actually ideologically an elitist. You know.
Yeah. No, that's fair. Whereas
Claire is, and you can't really completely separate these things. You can't say neoliberalism is one or the other, but Claire is like this mode of neoliberalism where it's just pure market. It's just
absolutely.
It's just preference. She is the mythical person that the economists imagine, with the preference scale in the pocket, where every decision is just self-interested utility maximization.
Well, you could also see her as a New Labour MP in a way that you couldn't see Stamper.
Yes, absolutely, exactly. Yeah, she is that ethos taken to its complete extreme, where it's it's smiling and personable and happy and friendly and relaxed, etc. And there's just nothing there. To me, that's what she's like. Blairism on the horizon.
She'd have been a thought leader for Change UK, man. She'd have been amazing if only they'd had her at that Nando's lunch. How different things might have been.
But I like though that the scenes that they get a few with her and Jeffrey Boozer Pitt, where he likes to see them as something close to incestuous siblings, and she's just clearly having none of that. But I like that he, again, this is the case, where you're not sure how much they believe their own bullshit and flannel and stuff, but Boozer Pitt's most perceptive thing seems to be that he can see that she's the future of the party and not him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah. He has self-awareness. He's not brave or clever, but he knows who and what he is.
Unfortunately, we now know that both she and him were the future of the party.
Future of both parties. That's a real worry.
That's the real problem, isn't it?
Yeah. But I think that, just to finish the thought though on the gender side, what I find fascinating though is the thesis of the first two shows is that if you've got someone who's, basically, the thrust of most of these stories up until the final part of this one is that the unprincipled person will always beat the principled one, because the unprincipled person can do anything and will do anything. I do think it's interesting though that when because I think we've identified, you're absolutely right. That's the difference with Claire. She's pure process. The narrative ends up punishing her.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. And I guess it's part of that is she's a casualty of the narrative pivot in the third story that says, no, actually, honestly, principles sometimes can win. And that's the whole point of Makepeace, right? That's the whole point of that character. Although I do think the final scene completely fucking undercuts that.
That absolutely.
In the most brutal, cynical way, which I love, by the way. I don't mean that as a criticism. I love brutal cynicism. And I adore the end of this. I really fucking do. It's so ugly. It's genuinely, I think, it's genuinely nihilistic.
I can almost take the ending away from it in isolation. I think, however much you think the show or series props it up, I think the ending just works in its own. What I mean is that 2 minutes works in its own sort of resonant way.
It's just a black hole. It just.
This show is not, this serial, I should say, is not what I would call good as such. I think it's probably better than To Play the King, because To Play the King just seems so narratively random and unsatisfying and flailing, whereas this does kind of have a self-contained story with a beginning and a middle and an end, instead of just being this labyrinth of dead ends, which is what To Play the King looks like. But the first one is my favorite by a mile, but this one does kind of end with this, because I've been talking about it as an investigation of the tension between politics as process and politics as content. And it's a bit sort of conspiracy theory-y, but it does kind of at the very end say there's actually a third point to this triangle, and that's structure.
Yeah,
and structure ultimately always wins in the back and forth between process and content. Always there at the base, you have structure, and that's what's represented by Corder, I think, just whispering in Makepeace's ear, we're here for you, so
we've got your back,
right
behind you.
I promise you both we're probably going to talk about the ending, but and as you observed there, we have to talk about Elizabeth and Corder in that. But just before that, I wanted to get, just because I think it would be remiss if we didn't talk about it, because it's such a unique feature of this compared to the other two, the fact that Urquhart's overstep and miscalculation and comeuppance ultimately comes from this Cyprus adventure, as he would see it, I guess. What do you, I guess Kit, you first like both based on when it was made and kind of, is it interesting that it's just so freighted, isn't it? This is another one we could do a whole episode on this, but like the fact that Urquhart's got this weird traumatic and also traumatizing past in Cyprus, and the fact that it's kind of this I know the phrase doesn't refer to this, but the sort of graveyard of empires where his sort of ambitions meet its doom as well, isn't it? On the sort of liminal Europe shall we say? What do you think of that? Because it's a bold choice, isn't it?
I mean, that's really interesting. It's one of the ways in which, I mean, I think I like what I appreciated this time, and I'm glad I didn't watch this. Like, I'm glad I had a 20-year gap, because I love this as a 17-year-old, and I have my appreciation for it is very different at my age. But I think that aspect of it, if I'd watched it in my 30s, would have really, really annoyed me, because it would have been like, oh, it's just too neat, it's just too obvious, it's just too whatever. The convenience of him having that negative experience in Cyprus as a soldier and then it coming back, like, but like, I've kind of got over worrying about shit like that now, and I'm like, I can go back to like, no, this is a work of fiction. It's okay in a work of fiction to do shit like that. Actually, it's fine if that's what they want to do, because that's the point they're trying to make, that's the effect they're trying to create. Let's just focus on whether or not it works, and let's not worry about the absurdity of it. So in that sense, it was kind of interesting, because I kind of it's the kind of thing I noted that I was thinking like, wow, this really would have bothered me maybe even just 5 years ago. This would really have annoyed me, and now I'm like, I'm totally cool with it. I'm just interested in seeing if it works. As far as Cyprus, I mean, for me, the most telling and chilling line, maybe in the entire trilogy, but certainly in this, is our Falklands. It's so great because that's the climax of the season. And by the way, does this show have the best climaxes of season of episode 3s ever? Like, I know the final part of Play the King really does fall apart, but episode 3, that cliffhanger at the end of episode 3 of Play the King, fucking awesome.
Yeah, you believe that if it gives you much comfort.
Yeah, the cliffhanger at the end of episode 3, our Falklands, that is a fucking way to close an episode of television, man. That's going to get you back through the door for part 4.
Well, I told you, just a brief sidebar there, I told you, didn't I, in the previous one, that that's one of the bits specifically I remember seeing at age 10, and I think I said to you before, I knew the Falklands through this and Adrian Mole. Right, and I had barely any idea what either of those works was talking about in terms of the actual war and conflict. And I, because it happened when I was -3 years old, and it resonated with me. I was like, I knew it was something doomy, it was something dangerous, it was something evil, essentially.
Yeah, But the moment in that scene that's really pivotal for me is Elizabeth. She's the one to watch, because it's Elizabeth who initially objects. Like her line, no, Francis, it's too unstable. We couldn't control it. And there's genuine fear on her face when she says that. There's genuine fear in her voice. And then he says it could be our Falklands. And she turns. Her expression changes. And there's an almost erotic thrill in her voice as she repeats, our Falklands. There's a reverence, there's an awe. And I think that's the thing about it that got me. I mean, I think the note I made was like, fucking hell, that the House of Cards trilogy understands UK politics better than the entire Labour right. Because there's this
that's a low bar.
Yeah, all right. But there's this narrative we're stuck with at the moment. And it's being used as a stick to beat Corbyn, because obviously, Corbyn's still in charge and therefore dangerous. But like, it's the foot thing, right? It's the longest suicide note in history thing. This is the version of history political history, that many of us have been brought up on and just told, this is the facts, this is how it happened. Thatcher won and she beat Foot because he turned up with this ridiculously long manifesto with all of this left-wing stuff, and the country wanted to go in a different direction. So Thatcher, and it's like, there was this thing called the Falklands that happened, and it's kind of fucking significant, because if you look at the polling before that moment, Thatcher was on course to lose to Foot, actually.
Yeah. And also Foot's manifesto was considerably less radical than previous manifestos, like in 74, I think it was, where Labour won. So
yeah. I mean, if we're gonna let the facts intrude, let's let them intrude, I guess. But but this is the point, right? Because that's the narrative I grew up on. I believed that completely uncritically for a long time, because it's what I was told by people who appeared to be sensible, who I didn't know better than to listen to. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, that's what I had. And it wasn't till, years later that I learned about, that pivotal moment with the Falklands War and how that fundamentally changed things. And of course, so for me, it's more about, again, it's the sins of Thatcher coming back, and it's Tory anxiety, It's really incredible. So I think for me, that's the significance. Yes, of course, the Europe thing. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, how the story starts with Francis saying, I've left my mark on the country, I'd like to leave my mark on Europe before I go. And he cannot, at that stage in the narrative, possibly have envisaged that meant where the narrative was going. But of course, you ask and the universe delivers. That's kind of because it's that kind of story,
Yeah.
I like that. I like that aspect of it. I thought it worked. And I got to say, the only thing about it that really heinously bummed me out watching it this time, really, really genuinely did upset me, is the idea that British forces killing innocent civilians in a foreign war would have any impact at all on a government. Let alone bring down a prime minister.
Well, isn't it? I'll let you chime in there, Jack, in a second. But one thing I was wondering thoughts of was because of Matty haunting. I'd say Matty actually less overtly haunts this. She is in there, obviously. Her voice is in there, but she's less in this than to play the king. I think she's become a less immediate ghost in some ways. But I find it interesting that the thing that brings him down, however plausibly, as you say, however implausibly, is the killing of girls, right? Like it's almost like the daddy's crime that can't be covered up in the end is is that is like the ultimate betrayal, even though they're not his girls, so to speak.
That's a flex at the end that I do appreciate, because I mean it's all the way through the series it's built up that it's going to be Matty that ultimately brings him down, and through much of this serial in particular, it's implied that it's going to be the thing that he did in Cyprus when he was younger that's going to bring him down, and it's not ultimately either. No. You get this strange, very strange, but I found it quite powerful moment at the end, where Tom is basically telling Claire, I'm done with you, where she hands him that incriminating letter about where Francis puts his report in about killing these young lads, and she's smiling and she thinks, oh, this is my way back into his good books, etc. And he's just, yeah, we know about that. It's not, don't need it. It's I mean, firstly, there's all sorts of complexities here. I mean, if you're going to talk about real world politics, the idea that Cyprus would be this huge, like Israel Palestine for Britain thing that's going to reshape Europe, etc. I mean, but you're absolutely right, Kit. This is about other stuff. This is Cyprus is a synecdoche. It's about Death on the Rock and the Falklands and all this stuff from the Thatcher era, haunting. And so what ultimately ends up, because there's a kind of it's just so conventional and usual. There's a kind of an alibi for imperialism in that the bloody crime is one rotten guy did a bad thing, and even in the bit at the end, the massacre at the end, it's the troops themselves, they're not bad guys. They didn't mean to do it. It was an accident. It was kind of this thing that happened because there were people there who opened fire on them, etc. And there's a lot to take exception to there, because that's the eternal alibi for the crimes of imperialism. We never mean to do it, and actually, there's a lot that's come out in recent times about the British conduct in Cyprus in the 50s during the resistance and the War of Independence, trying to chuck the British out, etc. And then it wasn't just a series of accidents. There were atrocities committed by British troops, as of course they, empires commit atrocities everywhere where they're challenged, etc., etc., etc. But the interesting thing is that instead of it being this private crime that ultimately brings Urquhart down, because it doesn't quite bring him down, but it's why I think it is decided that he has to go. He has to be put down like the dog at the start. Instead of being this private crime, the murder of Matty, or the private crime of killing the two young men in Cyprus, it is not. It is instead, it's a public crime. It is a catastrophic failure of political judgment, which leads to sending troops into a foreign country, and the inevitable happens. However much you can complain about the way it sanitizes imperialism, it is nonetheless a depiction of the British government sending armed intervention into somebody else's politics and polity, and the end result being, however it happens, it ends up being a load of dead civilians, and that being what brings him down, with the other things ultimately being relatively irrelevant. That was a pleasant surprise to me.
It's really fascinating that, though, because I think that what I find so interesting about that is that the show both goes that far and then, for me, also at the same time completely fails to really take responsibility. Because the flip side of it is, and I know you said this, but I just want to put my finger on it because it's so important, the show is very, very clear that it's not necessarily the military intervention that's the problem, but it's because Urquhart's leading it.
He doesn't know where to stop. Yeah.
It's Urquhart's orders that keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. So the implicit alibi is, if only we'd had Makepeace in charge, it would have been handled okay. And again, that's just the myth of like, this is the myth that we keep getting sold in terms of military intervention, humanitarian military intervention, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And basically, if you look at the history of military intervention over the last 80 years in the world and Europe, you've got World War II, I'll put in the plus column with an asterisk next to it. And that's kind of it. Right? But that's it. But that's the myth we keep getting sold again and again and again. That is used to justify empire again and again and again. And the show, what's weird about the show is it manages to, because everything you said is right, Jack. It is a pleasant surprise. It's kind of incredible. And again, my cynicism is heartfelt about like, if only that fucking brought down a government once in a while.
Yeah.
Because that's the trouble. For me, that's the other thing. This feels painfully naive.
It is, yeah.
This feels incredibly, and weirdly in 90, watching this as a kid, it felt so cynical. And now, post Iraq, you look at it and think, well, Jesus.
Well, what's fascinating is that the BBC would not get away with creating and broadcasting something like this now. If they broadcast something like this now that was about, this critical, quote unquote, critical of explicitly a Tory prime minister and a Tory government and British military intervention and corruption, etc., etc. The screaming of left-wing bias, etc. It would shatter the fucking moon. The whinging and screeching about it. And so that's a sign of the times. But as you say, looked at objectively, this is a childishly naive view of politics where, the public see some dead bodies that are caused by the government, and that's it. The government's fucked.
Well, I will push back on that a little bit though, because I think moments of prime ministerial weakness, whether they're in real life or whether they're in fiction, when prime ministers are a whole below the waterline, I'm thinking of like Theresa May, for example, after the 2017 election, and then Grenfell happens. These moments that implicate them, whether correctly or not, take on huger resonance as well, don't they? It's when blood's in the war again. It's when the badger's been nipped.
What I think we see is, again, it's the third point of the triangle. Beyond content and process, we have structure, and when structure, this intermeshed framework of entrenched power and entrenched interests, where the civil service meets the big business, meets the media, etc., when they decide that some dead bodies mean that a prime minister is no longer up for the job, then suddenly it becomes the fact that the prime minister is no longer up for the job because of the dead bodies. When that same structure doesn't care, then it's not.
Well, even before the dead bodies, it's funny, isn't it, that Bruce Bullerby, the newspaper editor from the second one, comes back for that brief scene in the Commons when Urquhart's trying to schmooze people, and you actually have and this is even before the Cyprus incident, you have the idea that the press is changing currents as it did in the in the 90s, and then again in the late noughties.
Of the downfall of Thatcher.
Well, and later the Brown government, right? Prefiguring it. But because that's what it reminded me of, when and that's one of the best bits as well of Urquhart losing his grip, and not even necessarily due to his tactics, just due to entropy. Is like he offers, he quite artfully and smoothly offers Bruce Bullerby a dependent lordship, right? And he does that, and then very quickly the next morning you just realize it didn't matter. It didn't, even Bullerby, who we know is this complete weather vane, cowardly, craven creature, is just like, nah, he's done. It's not worth it anymore, and the papers turn against him.
But the weird thing about Urquhart is that up till now, he has been, in his own way, a consensus builder. The consensus is built upon threats and domination and humiliation and sadism and, backhand, etc. But he builds a framework around himself that anchors him. By the time you get to Final Cut, all he's really got is, please do what I want, I'll give you a knighthood. And it just doesn't work because it's not enough. It's just a system of bribery rather than a system of building alliances.
I also think Sarah articulates it really well in To Play the King, where she says, you've realized that I mean, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but she basically says, like, you've realized that actually you only need to win over 40% of the country. That's all you need, and you know that's all you need, and the rest can go hang. So you don't even bother trying to reach the rest.
I think what you said before, though, as well about Jeffrey Boozer Pitt, he has his limit as well, and that is, as you say, only slightly, and only probably like a mild perturbation, and half of that is him thinking he should react this way in this moment. But he does have a line, and Dead School Children is sort of a line, and obviously he's enmeshed in the machine, but there are millions of voters a bit like him as well. They have lines that, even if they don't know them until they see them, where the image of Urquhart's, the image of Britain that Urquhart is creating and is molding and is projecting, I guess is feeding off, doesn't work for them anymore,
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, I think it's contextual though, isn't it? Because that's the thing. It's like, I mean, we're in current situation in 2021 where the bodies have piled high.
Well, yeah, exactly.
And we knew they were going to, and we know why, and we know now, we're fairly confident that the people in charge knew that was going to happen and made a calculated decision. That's what they wanted to do. And, the Tories are somewhere between 6 and 10 points ahead in the poll, depending on what poll you read. So do the bodies matter? It depends. Depends on what else is going on, what the rest of the narrative is, what else is happening.
Other things. Yeah. Depends on
But
context.
And to be fair, the final cut does that as well, because if the Cyprus situation had happened in part one of To Play the King, it probably wouldn't have been the end of Urquhart. Urquhart was already on the way out. He's already an entry. And let's not forget, that's why it happens. He manufactures that military situation. By the way, dangerously scuppering his own retirement plan. I mean, we haven't really talked about this aspect of it yet. Urquhart's incredibly self-destructive in this.
Yeah,
I mean, it is suicidal what he does in the
he manufactures his own heir apparent as well. The reason, one of the material contextual reasons why what happens is so damaging to him is precisely because Tom Makepeace is there in the wings.
Yeah.
And it's really Urquhart who puts him there. And this is another thing that really is another echo with the Shakespearean tragic heroes, because they are all intensely self-destructive,
Yeah. It's interesting, actually, that if he'd left Makepeace in position for a few more weeks as Foreign Secretary, Makepeace might have been destroyed by this.
Yeah,
or by a version of this, by Urquhart continuing to maneuver in a more controlled level, perhaps more controlled by Elizabeth, but by the machinations necessary to get their payout, and I'd also just say that, the Urquhart Trust, or whatever they call it, the kind of 7 million or something that's coming their way through shady oil deals, compared to some of the stuff that Blair's been involved in since he stopped being Prime Minister. I was just thinking, I don't really begrudge them that.
There's the painful naive thing again, isn't it? Really?
Exactly.
Just 7 million.
Just
the one oil deal.
Where you basically have to do an oil deal. It's like, then you're out. I'm like, that sounds all right.
He's the Prime Minister for like 11 years, and towards the end he thinks, I should probably think about some sort of retirement package for myself.
I know.
I'll get my wife to set up a dodgy deal with some Cypriot oil millionaires or whatever it is, and I'll have £7 million. It's oh, my dear sweet summer child.
But that's one of the things I find really fascinating. He doesn't do that. It's all Elizabeth. She drives the whole thing. Elizabeth's the one literally having the conversation with whoever he is. I think he's the party chair. I can't remember, but saying like, so how does this work exactly?
Yeah, with Julian Fellows.
Yeah, how is it that all these ex-PMs end up with millions? Because it's not the book deal, right?
Although she's playing a version of Elizabeth there, isn't she? I think,
Yes,
which she does obviously much more overtly when she's talking to the judge.
I love that moment, because I got to admit, I think I'd forgotten the intricacies of how that played out, because that conversation with the judge, I thought, oh, that's not really Elizabeth, is it? But of course, no, it fucking isn't. She's doing what she always does.
No, it's one of the funniest scenes in it.
Arch manipulator. Yeah, no, wonderful.
Oh, I love it. We'll get onto Elizabeth more in a second, I promise. But what I really like is when the judge comes back to her and is angry and knows that he's been fucked over, and she manages to put him back in his box perfectly, but without quite dropping that false version of Elizabeth she was playing.
Yeah,
everything she says is kind of the ditzy Elizabeth, but it just has so much more meaning and power now and poise, and kind of she knows where to put the stiletto blade, and it's kind of it's just
that's one of my favorite scenes, because she basically says, yeah, I know there's a difference between evidence and gossip, but you heard the gossip and you acted on the gossip because you hate the French.
Yeah.
And it's, to me, it rhymes beautifully with that business that in other ways completely sort of out of nowhere, an irrelevant bit where Claire goes to pick up the letter and she has this conversation with the guy who he said, it's in a clear envelope, and he says, yes, but I don't look at it.
I avert my eyes.
My eyes.
Yeah.
That's one of those things that stuck with me as a kid as well. And it's just
too.
that's how these minor actors can just steal a scene and remain lodged in your head, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's not a very important scene in a lot of ways, but I love it.
That's a line read for the ages. I avert my eyes, because he says it twice, and I'm the same. That stuck with me, and I hadn't realized it was from this. I got a real thrill when I got to that scene. I was like, oh my god, it's that guy! It's the I avert my eyes guy.
Yeah, it's great.
It has that double meaning as well, doesn't it? I avert my eyes. Well, so much of this depends upon people averting their eyes.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, Jack, you must love the metaphor of proof of war crimes contained in a clear folder, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
No one looks at. Yeah.
I want to kind of bring us into the relative home stretch now, but and we'll move on to talk about. I think we're going to have to talk about Elizabeth. We're going to have to talk about Corder, and I think that inevitably means we talk about the ending a little bit more. But just before that, I just wanted to ask you a quick, and it's kind of a nitpicky thing, but it's something that occurred to me on watching this time, that because we touched on it there. Do you remember we talked about Matt, the tape, with Matty's death in it, which has been around for a while, and in this, the plot mechanic is that it's in Corder's possession, and Corder sends it to Makepeace. You see that happening, right? He puts it in an envelope. It's addressed to Makepeace. Makepeace has it. It's not made a big thing of, but he has it, and he confirms to Urquhart that he has it. Why?
Yeah.
And this is honestly, I've watched this about 15 times or something over the years, and I think this is the first time where I overtly was like, that part of the plot, other than reminding you about Matty, is like, I don't understand why. I just don't understand why Corder does it.
My guess is that Corder and Elizabeth at that point want Francis to quit, because they want him to quit while he's ahead, or before he digs the hole any deeper. So I think what my guess would be, they send it to Makepeace, so thinking Makepeace can use this to pressure Francis to back down and quit before we have to kill him.
Oh,
that's my guess.
That works, actually. Yeah. So in that sense, you mean the scene, the very brief scene where Makepeace goes to visit Urquhart, is his last chance.
It's basically his last chance to avert his own death. Yeah, at the hands of that third part of the triangle, the system. Yeah.
But doesn't that imply that Elizabeth would be happy with the tape? With Urquhart's reputation being destroyed through the release of the tape.
Well, the tape wouldn't come out, would it? Makepeace would threaten him with it, and he would back down. Makepeace would then not publish the tape.
Do you think at that stage?
Yeah, because I think the deeper point is it's setting up Corder's final line. Because I think the point is it's actually Corder providing the tape to Makepeace is the ultimate power play. Because what Corder's saying is, to Makepeace, this is the level of control we've got. And I don't think Makepeace can publish it, because I think if Makepeace tries, the implication is,
well, no, nobody would do that.
No,
you'd be damaging your own party. He was part of Urquhart's government. Turns out that your party was led by, your government was led by, you were in the cabinet of a man who actually physically, personally murdered a young journalist. You'd never do that. You'd use it to pressure him to get what you want, but you'd never publish it.
You know what he got clean away with as well? Stamper.
Yeah.
He didn't. He's never implicated for that.
That's the real tragedy here. Let's be honest.
This is the Stamper memorial podcast.
Yeah.
But
I like one thing that does I think indicate where a lot of this comes from. Stamper, I understand, is not in the first book.
That's right.
He's an invention of Andrew Davis.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Andrew Davis does that because Urquhart needs somebody to talk to, right? It's a basic structural problem with the script. Otherwise, there needs to be a joist there. You need a character. You need a good old Robert Holmes double act so that they can talk to each other, right? Andrew Davies does exactly the same thing when he adapts Bleak House. He creates, talk about the chutzpah of creating a character in a Dickens adaptation. He creates out of whole cloth a character who's Mr. Tulkinghorn's clerk. I can't remember. He gives him a wonderfully Dickensian on the nose name. It's something like Screw or Sprocket or something. I can't remember. But he invents a character and he gives him to Tulkinghorn. so that Tulkinghorn has somebody to talk to.
Yeah, that's definitely what Stamper is, and whatever else he becomes later in the narrative, that's kind of his role there, isn't it?
Yeah,
and that's why he's missed as well. And that's why he in his own way haunts it as well, because
he steals every scene he's in because he's Colin Jeavons. So.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's fucking brilliant. It's like you think Francis Urquhart is a scary motherfucker.
Colin Jeavons is probably the only English actor of his generation who could have played the Joker.
Yeah. Well, he kind of did in the Hitchhiker's Guide. I mean, the compare at the restaurant at the end of the universe, that kind of is great. The Joker, isn't it? I mean,
he's got like the whole Conrad Veidt kind of like face going on there. Yeah,
so good.
Yeah, no, I love that. I loved something. I think it was after we'd rewatched House of Cards. Kit, I stumbled onto Restaurant at the End of the Universe. That bit of Hitchhikers on BritBox. I was just like, hang on.
Oh my god. Yeah, that's one for the ages, I think.
Apparently, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that apparently the guy who plays Jeffrey Boozer Pitt has done a lot of Big Finish, and is in a Matt Smith era televised short as well, where he played Albert Einstein, which is on YouTube.
He was in something else I know I've seen him before somewhere, and it was in something like Robin of Sherwood or some crap like that. I can't remember. But
he was in Killing Eve. I mean, I don't remember seeing him in Killing Eve, but he was in it.
Oh wow!
Yeah, according to IMDb. Yeah, I think he maybe got killed. I don't know.
That does happen in Killing Eve.
It does. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you guys, because I think you've already probed at this a little bit in what you've just said about Elizabeth and some of the decisions she and Corden may take here. I was going to ask you the sort of basic idea for when do you think Elizabeth turns on Urquhart, but I think it's a bit more complex than that. But also, I think it's been overridden in my head a little bit by something else, because I think we were talking before about the climax being so memorable and being like in a self-contained way just really, really indelible television, and certainly very impactful on me as a kid. I think there's a certain way in which for that twist to work, and I think it does work, you've got to, in an implausible way, even in this show, remove Elizabeth from almost the entirety of the last part. And for it to be a twist, for the fact that Elizabeth is involved with this, you've got to kind of remove her from the narrative, and it's because you've got to take Urquhart's brakes off, right? Really. And you both mentioned the cliffhanger of part 3, the R. Falkland scene, where Elizabeth is the brakes, and then, as you say, she seems intoxicated, enamored of the idea. And then there's a bit of that as well when it starts getting positive tabloid headlines. She's kind of still enjoying it,
Yeah.
And then she disappears. And I think it's because she can't be in the show after that, because she would, if necessary, wrestle him forcefully to the ground and handcuff him to the bed so that he didn't leave the bed and, be prime minister anymore, because he's clearly fucking it up. So like it's you almost have to take her out of the plot. But also that in universe, if you like, that leaves you to think, when did she give up on him, in a sense?
So my read on that, for what it's worth, is Elizabeth knew very well, and this fits with what we do see of her even in that scene where she does become enamored. She knows it's a roll of the dice. And I think Elizabeth has already got some version of the contingency plan that happens in episode 4 mapped out in her head if it goes to shit. And I think her disappearing from the screen is because she's being busy, because she knows if the shit goes down, she needs an exit strategy, and she knows what it is. I actually think in that, this is complete bullshit, but I actually think in that My Falklands moment, all of that's going on in her head. I think she sees the entirety of it, and she sees the upside, she sees the downside, she knows what her plan is if the downside is what lands. I think it's all happening, because I think Elizabeth is always 17 fucking moves ahead of Francis. Always.
She has repeatedly had to sort of reach in and prod him, hasn't she? Throughout the entire series. Every now and again, she sees that he gets 98% of the way there, and she has to kind of reach over and just give him that extra push.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably how she thinks of what she does. I don't think she ever gives up on him. I think it's just, the last thing that needs to happen is that he needs to stop being alive. It's another instance of him not being able to get past 98%. So again, I have to reach in and nudge. I think that's all it is. And I think she probably thinks of it as for his own good, in exactly the same way that, Urquhart would have thought of it as for her own good when he shoots the dog at the very start of the show.
Yeah.
She was a good bitch, but her time has come,
It's almost impossible to get away from the Dark Mirror Jackie Kennedy thing as well, isn't it? Like the kind of planning for her retirement as planning for their retirement has now very quickly become planning for her retirement.
Yeah, I mean, I think the image of that final, I mean, the final sequence is almost surreal. It's almost hallucinatory. The giant statue of Thatcher, the singing of the singing of God Save the King, which of course fits in the universe but feels discordant to us because that's not the song any of us have ever heard. Although
the king's there, is he? The young king is actually there.
Yeah, the young king's there. And you've got the would-be assassin coming through the crowd. You've got the guy who was actually wronged, let us not forget. It's interesting. So the way that Urquhart secures a win in the novel is Urquhart actually incites his own assassination by the Cypriot in the novel. He gives this speech, and in the speech he says he takes responsibility for the dead of Cyprus, and he claims them as his own. That's the language he uses. I claim them. I claim them as my own. I claim them as my responsibility. And that finally just pushes the guy over the edge, and he shoots Urquhart. And because he shoots Urquhart and kills him, and obviously he's immediately taken out, the Tories have a snap election and win in a landslide. So Urquhart's final victory is to secure Conservative rule for another 10, 15 years in the novel. And lovely Boozer Pitt survives as well. Like Urquhart set things up so everyone who's his political enemy is destroyed. He has all these little scandals that he leaks to the press, and they all go out after he dies. So he destroys all of his enemies in the party as well. I'm pretty sure, including Makepeace, except Boozer Pitt, who somehow scrapes through, which is really cute.
So again, we have like the Tory faithful authored version.
Yeah, exactly.
It is very much a fantasy fulfillment, even in death. It's kind of like sacrifice for the good of the party and the country, etc.
There's something more perturbing in the Davis adaptation.
Yeah, the Davis adaptation is the same story filtered through something much more ambivalent and anxious. So you get really, it's not the Conservative Party winning through Urquhart's self-sacrifice. What you get is this weird, sinister.
It's the deep state, isn't it?
It kind of is, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's kind of a bit
really
conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
It reminds me a little bit of that Bill Hicks joke about when you get elected president, the first thing they do is take you to see the secret film of the Kennedy assassination from a different angle.
That's right. It's footage of the Kennedy assassination from an angle you've never seen before.
Yeah. And then the blind goes up, and the guy smoking the cigar says, "Any questions?" Just only what my agenda is.
Jack, there was one bit of imagery you talk about the surrealism, Kit, of like the final scene. Like I was going to get into this, but Jack, did you hear on one of our previous podcasts when I was telling Kit about the fact that Susanna Harker is distantly related to Bram Stoker's friend?
Yes.
Yeah, that's gold. Still,
that's fantastic.
Repeat my greatest hits, but the reason I was mentioning it is this time watching the final scene when Urquhart's expires and the final scene of him dead. He looks like he's a Hammer Dracula, because he's got the blood trickling from his having been staked. He's got the blood trickling from his mouth, and that brought me back to a couple of scenes. I think they're both in the final part. The first is when it's wonderful scene with Boozer Pitt. We were talking about Kit. Where is your heart?
Where is your heart, Jeffrey?
closer still.
That's so great.
Which is amazing. But there was always.
I'm pretty sure that's a quote from something as well, but I can't place it.
we need to get that in DMs afterwards, Jack. But that's obviously very Dracula-esque as he has been several times, often more often with female characters. But and that gives his relationship with Jeffrey a kind of ambiguous sexuality as well. This is the first time we've seen him behave like this around a guy, exactly. But the other one I was thinking is his final confrontation with Maria on, we've talked about being haunted by previous scenes on the roof garden.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
It is.
The phrase I was thinking is, when he's talking about the Greek boys that he killed and he's trying to sort of discredit, you actually found it's a lie immediately afterwards because he talks to Elizabeth about it, but he talks about them as being, turncoats, essentially, about being double agents. And it's the language he uses. He says, they were mine. I turned them. And I'm just like, that's so vampiric. It's so weird and occult. And, even if it seems to be something he's making up, but even just and it's such arcane language, he has to explain to her what he means. He's losing kind of grip with our reality,
It's also I do think though, it's what's impressive about that, it is in its way a plausible lie in the moment, and I like that about it as well. When we hear it, bear in mind as the audience, when we hear it, we don't actually know the truth of the matter. And I had not remembered all the particulars of it, and when he said that, I thought, yeah, that's plausible. I could see that. That might be what actually happened.
I like how ready she is to believe him. You get this. The actress gives an interesting performance because she genuinely puts across an ambivalence about him a lot of the way through. She seems to actually sort of to like him and kind of want to believe that he's telling the truth. And you like this, the very end where you get this weird, creepy echo of what happened on the roof at the end of the first one. Only this time he can't do it. You know, he's again, it's like he's no longer capable of what he used to do. You get the feeling that that's the culmination of a longer process where, you know, if this was 10 years ago, he might even have ended up in bed with this woman.
I mean, that's one of the things that I noticed. It's almost like the character of the woman, the other woman in the first two stories, is split in two in this. You know, because you've got her and you've got Claire, and they both have aspects that relate to Mattie and Sarah, but they're distinct, but they're separate characters at the same time. Because she's, you know, because she's, you know, she's the younger character, and she's got more of that kind of, you know, she's that kind of young, conventionally attractive, whatever, you know, she's got that kind of look to her. And I think the naivety as well, you know, the naivety of Mattie, the naivety even of Sarah to a degree. Whereas the sexual energy is there, you know, with Claire.
Yeah, but she's outside his grasp in another way that we didn't comment on, which is that she didn't vote for him. She says this is the first time we've had someone just come out and go, just like an ordinary character, go, yeah, I'm not a Tory.
That's true.
Even Mattie and, you know, obviously not Sarah, but Mattie didn't go that far, did she? You know, like, you know, the Dracula thing again. She's not under his spell.
Well, we're back to the one of the interesting things about the House of Cards Toryverse is that the opposition just doesn't exist. I mean, like they're not real. They're not real people. They're not there.
The Tory anxiety is profound, but it's not about the opposition taking their place. It's about them, and this is really quintessential to conservative thinking. The anxiety is always about, you know, you, the proper authorities, the party of government, the proper rulers or whatever, not being able to cut it anymore. And that is just this perennial obsession, neurotic obsession of reactionary thinking. This worry about, you know, the regime, the proper way of doing things, the old ways, the traditions or whatever, they're kind of not working anymore. They're falling apart. They don't, you know, I called it the cucking of Francis Urquhart earlier, but it does have this libidinous quality to it, which is all bound up with, you know, domination, etc. And that's in this. I mean, there's the scene where Geoffrey refers to Francis as the biggest swinging dick in Westminster, and then you get several scenes where people's effectiveness, always men, their effectiveness is phrased in terms of, well, he's a limp prick, is a phrase that's used, etc., etc. And you get this emphasis on Urquhart's age as well. He's horrified when he gets the age-concerned people helping him celebrate his 65th birthday.
Yeah, that's really funny, that bit.
That is an authentically brilliant fucking moment, by the way. Yeah. I love that.
I love that his young aide is patronizing him.
Yeah.
You know, this is Francis Urquhart, and he's the prime minister, and yet this young man kind of treats him like he's a sad old duffer.
Yeah. Well, and if you listen to him as well, you know, he's meant to be a fool, but he's like, you know, he's like, I can't work bloody miracles. And if Urquhart had just heard that in the moment, just be like, yeah, you're right, I'm done. Like, you know, if he managed to make an exit, obviously still he'd be on the Urquhart terms, but, you know, yeah. I'm sure there's a million other things we haven't covered, but I did want to mention just additionally, as it was about laugh lines, the bit when Elizabeth's like, couldn't the Arts Council do something? And he's like, don't you remember we abolished the Arts Council last year? That's
just
really funny.
Just the implicit fact that national service has been reintroduced.
Yes, I was going to say that. I really love that, because that's something, again, that's in his platform into Play the King, and I love the passing references to national service, because of course actually it's part of the, you know, there's an argument that part of the reason that it goes completely to shit in Cyprus beyond Urquhart's orders are the fact that the soldiers are, some of them, national servicemen,
terrified
completely
boys,
out of their goddamn depth. You know, I mean, that's true in every war to a degree, but you know what I mean? I think I like that again, it's the same as singing God Save the King. I just appreciate those nods to the alternate universe at this point that the show's inhabiting. You know, I like that.
But isn't that thing about inexperienced national servicemen, because I agree that's in there, isn't that nicely, I'm not sure if it's deliberate, but isn't that nicely undercut by the fact that you learn that Urquhart committed war crimes as a trained officer? They make a point that he went to officer training. They sort of even asked him about it, and they were like, was it straight out of into your service? And he was like, no, I trained at the college. And then you learn that he then went and did those things. So it's kind of it's that it might be seen to be sort of an elitist point, and then it undercuts it like, no, people doesn't, to an extent it doesn't matter what training you've had, and the traditional idea you have of keeping your head cool in this sort of situation, you will still go out there and do terrible things.
Or it's the two different kinds of war crimes, right? There's the war crime of I'm 17 years old and I've got a gun in my hand and I don't have a fucking clue what I'm doing. Or there's the war crime of I'm the born to rule aristocrat and I'm going to do what I deem is necessary, which in this case just happens to be a war crime, right?
Yeah. on that happy note, Jack, do you have any final thoughts on that, Jack, before we wrap?
Just really that there is a good moment where Urquhart looks at the camera, stroke at us, and he says, you chose me, so yes. what I do is on you, essentially. And it's, again, it reminds me of a bit of Shakespeare. There's the Upon the King's speech from Henry V, where Henry is, he's trying to shift the blame for what's going to happen next day, off himself. But the people that order troops into situations where war crimes happen, they do have an extra responsibility, and I think that's really the nature of that distinction, isn't it? I think what's happening there is we're seeing the difference between polished, trained officer class, knows what it's doing, normal operation of imperialism as just this calculated savagery in what Urquhart does, versus the people are just as dead, but even so, these are just kids who've been ordered in, and in these sorts of situations, it's always going to end this way. And I think it's despite Urquhart's attempt to implicate us, I think there is a refutation there, or you can read it as a refutation of his attempt to shift the blame.
I mean, the line is "everything I do, you partake of," which is a great line.
Which is one of those things that's kind of true, but it's nowhere near enough by itself. If you just take that by itself, it's distorting.
Well, it's kind of true and it's kind of not. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we're getting to closing remarks, I guess the only thing I'm slightly concerned is we haven't addressed the important issue of whether or not Elizabeth and Corder are at it like rabbits.
Well, there's even a question.
I think it's weirder than that. I think I think it's good that we humans cannot know what they what they do. I think they just blend in this kind of Lovecraftian kind of,
because the moment where she goes into Corder's bedroom and they're both in dressing gowns, I'm like, I don't want to know what happens when that door shuts.
His vest.
I don't even.
He's such a weird looking actor, isn't he?
He is.
He's so
brilliant.
huge. You know how much taller he is than Claire in that scene where he takes the document off her.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I really love, actually, there's a great scene in the war room I think it's the cabinet office or in Downing Street somewhere in number 10, where the general just says, our chaps on the ground are telling us this is what's going on, and Corder looks up and says, yeah, my chaps are saying the same thing. And they share a look, and the general fucking hates him.
Yeah, well, the general doesn't. He says like, Commander Corder. He's like, we've met.
Oh God, it's great, isn't it?
What's going on there?
Pure disgust. Pure and I love that. Again, I love that. It's just the idea that, I mean, again, it's just what we talked about before. It's not about, there's no such thing as the opposition as we'd understand it, but within the power structures, these are the conflicts. And in that particular case, obviously, it's the military versus intelligence, right?
Yeah,
which is quite a funny thing to say out loud, but you know what I mean. The military services versus the intelligence services. But I love that animosity there. I love that, and it's what I love is the general hates him, and Corder just couldn't give a fuck. So it tells you so much about the power dynamic between those two men. Yeah, and it's not even done really in the script. It's in the way they react to each other.
Does anyone else kind of want to see at least one episode of the Makepeace show, which is Makepeace trying to be prime minister while Corder and Elizabeth live next door? He's like, why is Elizabeth not moved out yet? And he's like, no one's answering him. No one's answering him on that.
Oh dear. Oh.
I just wanted to mention the gift that he gets of the prince from Mr.
Oh God.
Because I dropped that clip of him reading from Richardson reading from the prince in the last episode, so that was good fun.
I just didn't want to get into the Cypriot businessman and the attendant stereotype stuff. It just felt like, I mean, it is what it is.
Slow hanging fruit in a sense, yeah. I mean,
I mean, the constant flirting with Elizabeth is the bit that really gets to me. It's just like, really.
Yeah. Although I do quite like. I don't know why I also need to defend these bits, but I like it in a sense. He's doing what she does to the judge. He's like playing a version of himself.
Yeah, I suppose.
You know what I mean? This is his bread and butter. You know, he's kind of charming middle-aged English ladies into this sort of situation is partly what he does. You know, but yeah, it's there.
Yeah, and then you have the whole sort of cutaway to Cyprus, where the president is this kind of sweaty, incompetent, panicking guy whose officers are surrounded by rampaging, irrational mobs of British imperial condescension is just where it's a hell of a drug.
It is.
It really
talking of plot flaws, there is that moment where Urquhart reassures him at the thing by saying, "Don't worry, we're right behind you. We'll back you with military intervention if necessary." And you think and then it doesn't. But then you think about cut to him in the palace going, "But you can't send troops in it. We'll send completely the wrong message." It's like
he does, doesn't he? Doesn't he actually do that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's like, well, dude, did you not realize that when he had his arm around your shoulder in the garden? Yeah. That's not actually going to fucking help you at all.
And then Urquhart slaps him down, doesn't he, for even having the presumption to tell him anything.
Pull yourself together, man.
Yeah.
Oh God.
Good fun. Well, anyway, thanks so much, guys. Thank you. I mean, thanks, Kit, for joining me a third time to wrap this up. And it's been such a great time. And Jack, thank you for joining us, and thanks for your input. You know, I think this is a richer third episode for your presence, and it was such a fascinating rewatch and such a great chat to have with you guys.
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me on. It's been a blast.
Such a pleasure. I just want to, I've cleared my schedule in order that you guys can tell us what you've been up to, because I know that's what it's going to take. So, I mean, Kit, would you like to let people know where to find you and what you've been doing?
Okay. Where should I start? So I'll start with fiction. I'm a fiction author. I write horror. I write crime thrillers. I write dark crime horror thrillers, short stories, and novellas and novels. If you want to find my fiction work, go to Amazon and look up Kit Power under authors, please. Otherwise, you'll get solutions for charging your phone in your car, which may be useful to you, but won't sell any of my books. So authors Kit Power, you will find everything I've ever written is available there. If you want to buy the ebooks, please buy them from Amazon, because that's the only place you can. If you want to buy the paperbacks, all of my work has ISBN numbers. Take those ISBN numbers to your local friendly bookshop and use them there, or indeed your library. That would be absolutely fantastic. If you want to catch up on my my non-fiction writing, I have a book called My Life in Horror Volume 1, which is a collection of essays where I talk about the things that messed me up as a child. That's available via the aforementioned method, but it's an ongoing column at the Ginger Nuts of Horror. So www.gingernutsHorror.com. And then if you look at My Life in Horrors, one of the menu options on the left-hand side, there's about 50 odd essays there. That's coming to a close fairly shortly. I also do reviews for Ginger Nuts of Horror, so you can find stuff there. I have a theoretically existing podcast called Watching Robocop with Kit Power. It's currently on extended hiatus, but if you look that up on Libsyn and subscribe, you'll get new episodes when they come in. There are 30 or so episodes of back catalogue that you can find there that I do recommend. They're good fun. And if you really like what I do and you're interested in getting something new from me every week for $1 a month, go to patreon.com/Kit Power and back me there. For $1 a month, you'll get something new every week. That will either be audio, podcast, or essay or fiction work. A couple of short stories went up there recently. The James Bond podcast I do of Human Bondage, that goes up there for early access, and a Patreon exclusive podcast that I do with Jack Graham, who you've heard tonight, and Daniel Harper, who you may not have heard tonight, but you will hear if you listen to I Don't Speak German, and who is amazing. And we're going through the entire Sherlock Holmes canon in order and doing a podcast about every single of those stories. I'm just about to drop episode 10 on that series on Patreon. So yeah, those are the places you can find me.
Well, Jack, beat that.
I can't possibly beat Kit. Let me see. I'm about to launch my ruthless Machiavellian bloody takeover of the United Kingdom. It's going to involve several murders, framing people, getting them executed, betraying members of my family. I'm going to need a crowd of people who will gather and behind the Lord Mayor and come and pretend to pressure me to take on the job of king, so I can be discovered with 2 priests and a Bible, and then I'll be holding the Bible upside down, and I can pretend not to want the job, etc. So if you want to be one of those people that acclaims me king, apply in the usual places. Put your answers on a postcard: London W10, BBC 1, Pebble Mill, 9DQ, Wood Lane, etc. Beyond that, I've got all sorts of things. I blog at Eruditorium Press. My strand is called Shaboom Graffiti. I have several podcasts. The main one is called I Don't Speak German, which is I Don't Speak German at Libsyn.com, where I help Daniel Harper tell the world about things he knows about Nazis. We've done, you might have heard a guy called The Crying Nazi, Christopher Cantwell. We've done episodes about him. All those people that were at Charlottesville chanting, etc. We do episodes about that and fill you in. And lately we've started to talk about people like Tim Poole and James Lindsay, which of course is a huge difference. So that's with Daniel. And I also have my own podcast, which is called The Shabcast. You can find it's part of an umbrella podcast. Kit's podcasts are all on this as well. Pex Lives, da, 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 da. And I've been doing a podcast this month with George Lee and Elliot Chapman, my buddies, about various spooky movies. They're good shows. We did Ghost
George
Watch.
Lee's been on the show, of course.
Yeah. We did Ghost Watch. We did The Stone Tape. I've been really enjoying that. We've got some more coming up. That's at the Pex Lives feed as well. As Kit said, he and I do the Sherlock Holmes podcast, which is on my Patreon as well as his. There must be more stuff. My Patreon, you get advance access to to my personal podcasts. You get exclusive access, apart from with Kit, obviously, to the Sherlock Holmes podcasts. There's probably 78 other things I'm forgetting, but that'll do for now. Oh, my Twitter is @_Jack_Graham_. And as I say, I do have a Patreon, hint, hint.
I think I hope you guys will both take this as a sincere compliment when I say that I see you both as something of a warning.
Harsh but true.
It's too late. You're already podcasting. You're in the quagmire with us, man.
Yeah,
there's no escape.
My Falklands. Great. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you. That was amazing. And I hope to have you both back on in the future. That'd be great.
Lovely.
Yeah. And see you all soon, listeners. Or feel free to say see you soon. Both. Oh, bye.
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 Thanks.
I always forget to mention that bit. You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert. If they ever do a VH1 style behind the music show about podcasts, can I interview you guys
about that? Yeah.
Oh
man.
yeah. No, I want to do that. I want to do that Garth Marenghi's Dark Place thing. Where I sit there going, "Oh, it was an amazing time. It was an amazing time."
Podcast was destroyed in a drink-related mishap near Fulham.
I did punch the child, and I feel fine about that.
Well, to do that properly, you'll have to pretend that one of you's dead now. Missing.
Oh God.
Yeah, it was a bit of a trip, wasn't it? That Wrong with Authority, with it just kept on splintering, didn't it, into more and more sort of fractal spin-off podcasts until,
yeah, no, that was something else. That really was. Yeah, but I think it's been great. I mean, I like the rhythms we've all fallen into since, though. I think it's been really good. Like we've got, you and I and now Daniel are doing the Sherlock Holmes thing, and obviously, I don't speak German. It's this incredible kind of rolling phenomenon now, which is brilliant. And it's like, and then we're all just and obviously Pex Lives is actually still going amazingly, and then James and I and Christine now doing Human Bondage. I mean, I love how it's kind of, we've created our own little, that kind of podcast cinematic universe that's come out of WWE.
Well, as I said, really, it's all kind of one podcast in just different forms. The whole thing.
That's definitely how you would enter it to the Turner Prize, I think.
Oh yeah.
A cinematic universe in podcast form. Yeah, that's the title.
I was going to actually, because I've got both of you two on, you talk about your current projects. I was looking up other stuff Ian Richardson had been up to over the decades, which I've sort of been digging a little bit since we talked about the first one, Kit. But I was looking up some of his Holmes stuff. And I think we mentioned that because you guys might be more familiar with these, because he's been in a couple of straight adaptations. I glimpsed the 83 Hound of the Baskervilles before I came on here, which sounded kind of interesting. But the thing that I kind of vaguely remembered being on telly when I was about 15, that one of you might be familiar with, is something called Murder Rooms.
Murder Rooms, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Funnily enough, I've never actually seen any of the shows where Richardson just straightly plays Holmes. I've never seen them. But yeah, I watched Murder Rooms, both the original miniseries and the series of individual episodes that followed it. Yeah.
Right. Are you familiar with the concept, Kit?
No, it's just the first time hearing of it.
Well, Jack, since you've seen it, do you want to explain it to Kit?
Yeah, sure. It's insane, but like so much telly, it's as I say, it's insane. I was going to say in a good way. I'm not actually sure it's good, really. Sort of objectives, but I enjoyed it anyway. It's like that Holmes is. I mean, this is overstated. People say Holmes is based upon Dr. Joseph Bell, who was one of Doyle's lecturers at Edinburgh University, and was kind of sort of involved with some helping the police with murder cases, and kind of sort of had some forensic pioneering work and some deductive methods, etc. And supposedly some of Holmes's methods and also personality traits are based upon Dr. Joseph Bell. I think it's overstated, but it seems to be a real thing, and people love it. And well, the premise of Murder Rooms is that it's about Dr. Joseph Bell solving crimes with Doyle as his Dr. Watson. That's basically it.
Okay.
And of course, Ian Richardson is Dr. Joseph Bell,
right?
With a very odd curly white wig, because Dr. Joseph Bell rather famously had sort of tightly curled white hair.
Okay.
So Ian Richardson, for historical accuracy, obviously, this is an important thing. He has to have the right hair. So he's saddled with this appalling wig all the way through it. And I think that they're different. It's different actors, isn't it? In the miniseries, it's I can't remember the guy's name. It's a young fellow who plays Doyle. And then in the series that followed it, they recast, and it's Charles Edwards as Doyle after Doyle has graduated and become a doctor in his own right. And it's the best one is the original miniseries, because it's Doyle as a young man at university, and he meets Dr. Bell, etc. And there's a serial killer at loose in Edinburgh, and it's full on cheese. There's loads of suspects and suspicious characters going around, and unfortunate women are being slaughtered. There's blood everywhere and shit like that, and it's full on sort of John Douglas Mindhunter. Oh, what does this pile of coins mean about the killer's psychology bullshit? And and it turns out to be Dr. Neil Cream, the famous poisoner,
right?
One of Doyle's fellow students at Edinburgh University. And
Is that true?
Yeah, well, no, I don't think so. I don't think it's true at all. This is why I think it's hilarious that they made poor Ian Richardson wear this silly white wig all the way through. Because that's what Dr. Bell looked like. And I said, well, what? Suddenly giving a shit about anything being accurate there,
It's funny the things they choose to give a shit about, isn't it? It's fascinating.
Yeah. You can make up whatever lies you like about Doyle's family, his school days, his university career, the being sort of serial killers in Edinburgh when he was young, and Dr. Bell pioneering FBI profiling techniques like Mindhunter 100 years ago. But as long as you get his hair right, we're fine. And then they had a spin-off series where, as I say, recast, and it's Charles Edwards, and it's a series, and it does that fucking thing that drives me around the bend, where writers can never make anything up. Anything that's in a story by a writer, he gets it from something that actually happened to him. So the stories all have elements of home stories in them. Like one of them is features a woman who's being followed on a bicycle.
Right. Yeah.
So Conan Doyle got all these story elements from real life, etc., etc. And there's one that's really weird where it's Rick Mayall playing a serious role. Rick, I don't know, poor old Rick Mayall. He was a good actor, but I just can't. He's just one of those people. The minute he turns up, I laugh. He was one of the most inherently funny people who ever lived. He's just one of those people like Peter Sellers and Richard Pryor. It's just they're just Peter Cook, isn't it? They're just funny. They just are. It's just in their every gene, And Rick Mayall has this very serious role where he's this sort of tortured police officer with a disabled wife, and he's got this grudge against Bell, and he's got these incredibly intense scenes where they argue, and no shade at all on Rick Mayall, but it's just it's so misjudged. But,
Rick Mayall makes me laugh in American Werewolf, and he's not even one of the funny characters.
Yeah, that's right. He just appears on screen with that look on his face, and you just
He kind of looks like he's wandered into the slaughtered lamb by mistake, but just years ago, and hasn't found the exit yet.
It's just, I don't know if it's a Pavlovian response, maybe for people of roughly our age. It's probably that, and nothing to do with him at all.
I mean, between the young ones and Bottom, he did do a number on like 1.5 generations, and then the guest appearances on Blackadder, where he would absolutely steal the entire show for the whatever it was 3 or 4 minutes he was on camera.
God,
and he
I'm not the world's biggest fan of Rowan Atkinson, I have to say, but you can't help feeling sorry for him.
Right. It's not remotely fair, is it?
Yeah, he seems to accept it with good grace. So it's funny when you were talking about the cliche that writers have to have drawn everything from their real life. There was a short film I remember from probably circa the turn of the millennium that was spoofing that was called George Lucas in Love, which was obviously a takeoff of Shakespeare in Love, but it was like a sort of 20-minute short film where George Lucas is just walking around his California apartment in like the 70s, and he looks out the window and sees a guy dressed all in gold or something, and he's like, there's like a telephone operator whose earphones look like bun hairstyle and things like that. It's just everything is just that, which just made me laugh quite a bit.
Yeah, no, it's a trope that drives me around the bend, I'm afraid. This thing where you dramatize the lives of famous writers or whatever, and you put stuff in the story that that's where that comes from. No, it just came out of his brain. Come on.
It's just so lazy. I know it's acting rather than writing, but it reminds me of that kind of anecdote. I'm sure I don't know if it's true or not, but it was Laurence Olivier and Dustin Hoffman on The Marathon Man. You hear about this one? And Hoffman's all like, giving the director endless like, what's my motivation for this scene stuff, and eventually the story goes, Laurence Olivier pulled him to one side and said, try acting, my dear. Which I've always like, the writing equivalent of that is like, no, sometimes we really do just make shit up.
Just make shit.
Part of the gig, really.
Of course it comes from stuff you've experienced, but it doesn't come that directly,
No.
Conan Doyle doesn't write a story about a young woman being followed by a mysterious man on a bicycle because he actually met and fell in love with a young woman who was being followed by a mysterious man on a bicycle. It's and the other thing, of course, is it's coming back to me now. There's an episode where I always get this wrong. It's Ian McNeice is the actor. I always say Louis McNeice because the name is mixed up, which is ridiculous. Ian McNeice, the actor, the guy. He plays a Canadian Irish Fenian terrorist or something, and it's absolutely bizarre. But the thing is, these stories, they're not Doyle stories. And Doyle, whatever you want to say about him, he was good at writing Sherlock Holmes stories, right?
Yeah.
So what you get is like this weird thing where the Sherlock Holmes stories are supposed to be based on these things that actually happened to Doyle. And the things that are presented as actually happening to him in real life are so bizarre and insane and ridiculous that it makes the process of writing the Holmes stories then becomes Doyle sitting down to say, right, well, how can I pare this down so that anybody will believe any of it?
Well, that's another interesting form of the Great Game, though, isn't it? Really, that's like, how do they all fit into the Holmes canon? But yeah,
oh yeah. I think this has come up in our Sherlock Holmes podcast, doesn't it?
It's funny you mentioned that because it's funny you mentioned Ian McNeice just randomly because I was just saying to Kit, I've been watching the partly to justify my Apple TV subscription. I've been watching the Asimov Foundation adaptation on Apple TV, which is a big, interesting old mess. And it's 6 episodes in of 10, so I haven't really formed an opinion yet. But it's Ian McNeice has a cameo as like a kind of minor like Trantorian functionary who is literally shouted to death by the IRA emperor, which is. Right. Which is the scene that actually it's the kind of scene I love. It's mental as a scene, but it like the guy playing the emperor is like one of the biggest overactors in the show. But it's one of the few where I laughed out loud because a lot of it's quite not even in an Asimov way, but just a lot of it's quite kind of modern Westworld TV solemn all the time.
Right, yeah,
quite a mixture of kind of really pretentious and then just really joyless for quite a lot large bits of it. And I mean, Asimov had its own problems with that kind of thing, but it's kind of, But anyway, that scene's hilarious.
Isn't it McNeice who plays the Baron in the TV miniseries based on Dune, or did I dream that?
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we're going to be the only podcast not talking about Dune this week. That's my resolution. So I'll cut that bit.
Yeah, cut that bit. As I say, yeah,
it's a badge of honor. That's good.
I was just saying, just before you rejoin the conversation at halftime, Kit, I was just saying to Jack that my girlfriend's currently, she's just wrapping up watching Scream. So I'm about to, and she's never seen it before. Hilariously, she said, I've seen Scary Movie, but not Scream. Which, fair.
That's great. I'm actually one of the last My Life in Horrors is going to be on Scream because Scream is the first horror movie I ever saw at the cinema.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I saw it, obviously at the age of 18 because it was an 18 certificate. And I saw it on Halloween on the year I turned 18. So I think I'll need to check that. Actually, that might not be right. I might have been 19. But anyway, yeah. So, and I have to write about it because I've done Last House on the Left and I did the Elm Street. So I've got to do Scream as the kind of, because that kind of is the Wes Craven trilogy. So,
wow, going back to the movie that you saw on Halloween as an 18-year-old, that seems like so ritual and cyclical that it's actually a bit dangerous. I don't know if you want to invoke those powers.
But it's Wes Craven, so I'm not remotely worried. Like, I'm sorry, he doesn't have that kind of power. Like, he's a very, I love Wes, but I love Wes Craven's work, but he's a very, I think Wes Craven genuinely makes comfort horror. Not Last House on the Left, admittedly. That was fucking terrifying. That was genuinely like one of the worst things. That probably is the most disturbing thing I've ever seen. It's certainly up there. But certainly by the time you hit Elm Street, that's what I love about Scream. Scream manages to be a commentary on horror whilst also being a horror movie, and as we know, I like things that do that. I love in the same way that RoboCop's an action movie and a commentary on action movies.
It's hard to remind yourself like how big Scream was at the time, like how significant it felt at the time as well. For especially if you're a teenager like me, where it's like
it's fucking brilliant.
It was kind of like the Pulp Fiction of horror.
Yeah, and it works. It holds up. Like
No, it does hold up.
I was telling David, I recently rewatched it for the first time, just purely coincidentally, and I was surprised by how good it was.
It's really fun.
The characterization is consistent. The plot is clever. It holds together. Obviously it's far fetched, but within the ground assumptions, it works. There's no logic. There's no logic in the plot where you go, nah, that doesn't work. And they pull off the very difficult trick of being knowing and meta and so on without seeming glib or condescending. It's a good movie.
It's really impressive. I mean, the murder of Henry Winkler is one of the all-time great "it's behind you" moments.
I love that character. I love that.
Yeah, I love that character.
I don't know. They managed to give that character so many dimensions with just like one or two very silly scenes.
Yeah, and I mean, dude can act.
I wish I'd been rewatching this now and not talking to you guys. I was going to say, I just love it. It wasn't meant at the time, obviously, because he'd not been in it yet. But I love the idea that one of the killers is Shaggy from Scooby-Doo.
That's perfect, isn't it? That's just absolutely.
It was Shaggy all along.
That's the meta level that you couldn't even dream to hit. That was one step beyond even what Craven had in his head. No, I love that, and it's just and it does these amazing gory set pieces that are just brilliant horror set pieces. The garage door.
Oh yeah,
that's just brilliant. I mean, that's just like 13-year-old me would have been doing cartwheels at how gross that was. It's just like perfect.
To me, it's when Skeet Ulrich reveals what he claims is his motive. For me, that's when the movie kind of ratchets up an extra notch. I appreciate that last minute turn, because it would have been so easy to not bother with that extra layer of psychology and characterization. You don't need it, but it's there. And it just, the minute it comes out, you think, thank you. You gave me something extra, and it works, and it's consistent, and it's interesting. And
I don't have kids, but if I ever do have kids, I think they're going to ask me one day, Daddy, what was a Skeet Ulrich? And why did it seem to matter at the time?
But I also like the politics of the guy who wrote and directed Nightmare on Elm Street. Having the final girl sleep with his girlfriend and then not be killed. I like him. It's complete. I mean, it's fucking explicit. Not in my movie. Bang. I love that. I love how it goes. Because that's the guy saying like, hey, yeah, you know what? There's a better way of doing it than the way I did it in the 80s.
Well, it's funny, Jack. I could say that I don't want to encourage you into more nonsense, but I kind of I remember you saying on a podcast, I think in the last 6 months, how you hated Cabin in the Woods.
I loathe that movie with a deep and profound, abiding. Yeah,
well, maybe you should make that into a double bill about Scream and why you like that, and Cabin in the Woods and why you don't.
Nice. I will one day treat of that film and settle accounts with it.
Is that going to be like the end of The Godfather? Like cross-cutting to different people who were involved in making it, like Chris Hemsworth walking down some church steps.
No, I give everybody a pass except Joss Whedon. To me, he can shoulder the entire blame.
I see.
Because I mean, Sigourney Weaver's in it, so if I start blaming individual people, that won't stand. So
Sigourney Weaver's bulletproof. I'm sorry, that's just like she gets a pass for life.
Just has she just has a license.
Yeah, she doesn't have to pay taxes anymore, and probably no,
that's right. Yeah, no more taxes ever.
I don't know about that,
but there's the line.
You see, that's why we're reformist scum, David.
That's fine.
Jack's like a Puritan.
Jack, you look Sigourney Weaver in the eye and tell her that you're not.
She has to pay the same taxes as everybody else.
You will crumble.